Chapter 49 of the Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 49. The Governor on his Guard. After leaving Eunice, my one desire was to be alone. I had much to think of, and I wanted an opportunity of recovering myself. On my way out of the house, in search of the first solitary place I could discover, I passed the room in which we had dined. The door was ajar. Before I could get by it, Mrs. Tenbruggen stepped out and stopped me. "Will you come in here for a moment?" she said. "The farmer has been called away, and I want to speak to you." Very unwillingly, but how could I have refused without giving offence, I entered the room. "When you noticed my keeping my name from you," Mrs. Tenbruggen began, "while Helena was with us, you placed me in an awkward position. Our little friend is an excellent creature, but her tongue runs away with her sometimes. I am obliged to be careful of taking her too readily into my confidence. For instance, I have never told her what my name was before I married. Won't you sit down?" I had purposely remained standing, as a hint to her not to prolong the interview. The hint was thrown away. I took a chair. "Selina's letters had informed me," she resumed, "that Mr. Gracedieu was a nervous invalid. When I came to England, I had hoped to try what massage might do to relieve him. The cure of their popular preacher might have advertised me through the whole of the Congregational sect. It was essential to my success that I should present myself as a stranger. I could trust time and change, and my married name, certainly not known to Mr. Gracedieu, to keep up my incognito. He would have refused to see me if he had known that I was once Miss Chance." I began to be interested. Here was an opportunity, perhaps, of discovering what the Minister had failed to remember, when he had been speaking of this woman, and when I had asked if he had ever offended her. I was especially careful in making my inquiries. "I remember how you spoke to Mr. Gracedieu," I said, "when you and he met long ago in my rooms. But surely you don't think him capable of vindictively remembering some thoughtless words which escaped you 16 or 17 years since?" "I am not quite such a fool as that, Mr. Governor. What I was thinking of was an unpleasant correspondence between the Minister and myself. Before I was so unfortunate as to meet with Mr. Tenbruggen, I obtained a chance of employment in a public institution, on condition that I included a clergyman among my references. Knowing nobody else whom I could apply to, I rashly wrote to Mr. Gracedieu, and received one of those cold and cruel refusals which only the strictest religious principle can produce. I was mortally offended at the time, and if your friend the Minister had been within my reach—" She paused, and finished the sentence by a significant gesture. "Well," I said, "he is within your reach now." "And out of his mind," she added. "Besides, one's sense of injury doesn't last, except in novels and plays, through a series of years. I don't pity him, and if an opportunity of shaking his high position among his admiring congregation presented itself, I dare say I might make a mischievous return for his letter to me. In the meanwhile we may drop the subject. I suppose you understand now why I concealed my name from you, and why I kept out of the house while you were in it. It was plain enough, of course. If I had known her again, or had heard her name, I might have told the minister that Mrs. Tenbruggen and Miss Chance were one and the same; and if I had seen her and talked with her in the house, my memory might have shown itself capable of improvement. Having politely presented the expression of my thanks, I rose to go. She stopped me at the door. "One more word," she said, "while Selina is out of the way. I need hardly tell you that I have not trusted her with the minister's secret. You and I are, as I take it, the only people now living who know the truth about these two girls, and we keep our advantage." "What advantage?" I asked. "Don't you know?" "I don't, indeed." "No more do I. Female folly, and a slip of the tongue. I am old and ugly, but I am still a woman. About Miss Eunice. Somebody has told the pretty little fool never to trust strangers. You would have been amused if you had heard that sly young person prevaricating with me. In one respect her appearance strikes me. She is not like either the wretch who was hanged, or the poor victim who was murdered. Can she be the adopted child? Or is it the other sister, whom I have not seen yet? Oh, come, come! Don't try to look as if you didn't know. That is really too ridiculous." "You alluded just now," I answered, "to our advantage in being the only persons who know the truth about the two girls. Well, Mrs. Tenbruggen, I keep my advantage." "In other words," she rejoined, "you leave me to make the discovery myself. Well, my friend, I mean to do it." In the evening my hotel offered to me the refuge of which I stood in need. I could think for the first time that day without interruption. Being resolved to see Philip, I prepared myself for the interview by consulting my extracts once more. The letter in which Mrs. Tenbruggen figures inspired me with the hope of protection for Mr. Gracedieu, attainable through no less a person than Helena herself. To begin with, she would certainly share Philip's aversion to the Masseurs, and her dislike of Miss Jillgall would just as possibly extend to Miss Jillgall's friend. The hostile feeling thus set up might be trusted to keep watch on Mrs. Tenbruggen's proceedings with a vigilance not attainable by the coarser observation of a man. In the event of an improvement in the minister's health, I should hear of it both from the doctor and from Miss Jillgall, and in that case I should instantly return to my unhappy friend and put him on his guard. I started for London by the early train in the morning. My way home from the terminus took me past the hotel at which the elder Mr. Dunboyne was staying. I called on him. He was reported to be engaged, that is to say, immersed in his books. The address on one of Philip's letters had informed me that he was staying at another hotel. Pursuing my inquiries in this direction, I met with a severe disappointment. Mr. Philip Dunboyne had left the hotel that morning, for what destination neither the landlord nor the waiter could tell me. The next day's post brought with it the information which I had failed to obtain. Miss Jillgall wrote, informing me in her strongest language that Philip Dunboyne had returned to Helena. Indignant Selina added, "Helena means to make him marry her, and I promise you she shall fail if I can stop it." In taking leave of Eunice, I had given her my address, had warned her to be careful if she and Mrs. Tenbruggen happened to meet again, and had begged her to write to me, or to come to me, if anything happened to alarm her in my absence. In 2 days more I received a line from Eunice, written evidently in the greatest agitation. "Philip has discovered me. He has been here, and has insisted on seeing me. I have refused. The good farmer has so kindly taken my part. I can write no more." End of chapter 49.
Chapter 50 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Tink. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 50. The News from the Farm. When I next heard from Miss Jillgall, the introductory part of her letter merely reminded me that Philip Dunboyne was established in the town, and that Helena was in daily communication with him. I shall do Selina no injustice if my extract begins with her second page. "You will sympathize, I am sure," she writes, "with the indignation which urged me to call on Philip, and tell him the way to the farmhouse. Think of Helena being determined to marry him, whether he wants to or not. I am afraid this is bad grammar, but there are occasions when even a cultivated lady fails in her grammar, and almost envies the men their privilege of swearing when they are in a rage. My state of mind is truly indescribable. Grief mingles with anger when I tell you that my sweet Eunice has disappointed me for the first time since I had the happiness of knowing and admiring her. What can have been the motive of her refusal to receive her penitent lover? Is it pride? We are told that Satan fell through pride. Eunice satanic? Impossible. I feel inclined to go and ask her what has hardened her heart against a poor young man who bitterly regrets his own folly. Do you think it was bad advice from the farmer or his wife? In that case, I shall exert my influence and take her away. You would do the same, wouldn't you? I am ashamed to mention the poor dear minister in a postscript. The truth is, I don't very well know what I am about. Mr. Grainger is quiet, sleeps better than he did, eats with a keener appetite, gives no trouble. But alas, that glorious intellect is in a state of eclipse. Do not suppose, because I write figuratively, that I am not sorry for him. He understands nothing. He remembers nothing. He has my prayers. You might come to us again, if you would only be so kind. It would make no difference now. The poor man is so sadly altered, I must add, most reluctantly, that the doctor recommends your staying at home. Between ourselves, he is little better than a coward. Fancy his saying, "No, we must not run that risk yet. I am barely civil to him, and no more." In any other affair, excuse me for troubling you with a second postscript. My sympathy with Eunice would have penetrated her motives. I should have felt with her feelings, but I have never been in love. No gentleman gave me the opportunity when I was young. Now I am middle-aged. Neglect has done its dreary work. My heart is an extinct crater. Figurative again! I had better put my pen away and say farewell for the present. Miss Jillgall may now give place to Eunice. The same day's post brought me both letters. I should be unworthy indeed of the trust which this affectionate girl has placed in me, if I failed to receive her explanation of her conduct toward Philip Dunboyne as a sacred secret confided to my fatherly regard. In those later portions of her letter, which are not addressed to me confidentially, Eunice writes as follows. I get news, and what heartbreaking news, of my father by sending a messenger to Selina. It is more than ever impossible that I can put myself in the way of seeing Helena again. She has written to me about Philip, in a tone so shockingly insolent and cruel that I have destroyed her letter. Philip's visit to the farm, discovered I don't know how, seems to have infuriated her. She accuses me of doing all that she might herself have done in my place, and threatens me. No, I am afraid of the wicked whisperings of that second self of mine if I think of it. They were near to tempting me when I read Helena's letter, but I thought of what you said after I had shown you my journal, and your words took my memory back to the days when I was happy with Philip. The trial and the terror passed away. Consolation has come to me from the best of good women. Mrs. Staveley writes as lovingly as my mother might have written, if death had spared her. I have replied with all the gratitude that I really feel, but without taking advantage of the services which she offers. Mrs. Staveley has it in her mind, as you had it in your mind, to bring Philip back to me. Does she forget, do you forget, that Helena claims him? But you both mean kindly, and I love you both for the interest that you feel in me. The farmer's wife, dear good soul, hardly understands me so well as her husband does. She confesses to pitying Philip. He is so wretched, she says. And dear heart, how handsome, and what nice, winning manners! I don't think I should have had your courage, in your place. To tell the truth, I should have jumped for joy when I saw him at the door, and I should have run down to let him in, and perhaps been sorry for it afterwards. If you really wish to forget him, my dear, I will do all I can to help you. These are trifling things to mention, but I am afraid you may think I am unhappy, and I want to prevent that. I have so much to be thankful for, and the children are so fond of me. Whether I teach them as well as I might have done if I had been a more learned girl may perhaps be doubtful. They do more for their governess, I am afraid, than their governess does for them. When they come into my room in the morning and rouse me with their kisses, the hour of waking, which used to be so hard to endure after Philip left me, is now the happiest hour of my day. With that reassuring
Chapter 51 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 51. The Triumph of Mrs. Tenbruggen. Miss Jillgall appears again, after an interval, on the field of my extracts. My pleasant friend deserves, this time, a serious reception. She informs me that Mrs. Tenbruggen has begun the inquiries which I have the best reason to dread, for I alone know the end which they are designed to reach. The arrival of this news affected me in two different ways. It was discouraging to find that circumstances had not justified my reliance on Helena's enmity as a counter-influence to Mrs. Tenbruggen. On the other hand, it was a relief to be assured that my return to London would serve, rather than compromise, the interests which it was my chief anxiety to defend. I had foreseen that Mrs. Tenbruggen would wait to set her enterprise on foot until I was out of her way, and I had calculated on my absence as an event which would at least put an end to suspense by encouraging her to begin. The first sentences in Miss Jillgall's letter explained the nature of her interest in the proceedings of her friend, and are, on that account, worth reading. "Things are sadly changed for the worse," Selina writes, "but I don't forget that Philip was once engaged to Eunice, and that Mr. Greystow's extraordinary conduct toward him puzzled us all. The mode of discovery which dear Elizabeth suggested by letter, at that time, appears to be the mode which she is following now. When I asked why, she said, 'Philip may return to Eunice. The minister may recover, and will be all the more likely to do so if he tries massage. In that case, he will probably repeat the conduct which surprised you, and your natural curiosity will ask me again to find out what it means. Am I your friend, Selina, or am I not?' This was so delightfully kind, and so irresistibly conclusive, that I kissed her in a transport of gratitude. With what breathless interest I have watched her progress toward penetrating the mystery of the girls' ages, it is quite needless to tell you." Mrs. Tenbruggen's method of keeping Miss Jillgall in ignorance of what she was really about, and Miss Jillgall's admirable confidence in the integrity of Mrs. Tenbruggen, being now set forth on the best authority, an exact presentation of the state of affairs will be completed if I add a word more, relating to the positions actually occupied toward Mrs. Tenbruggen's enterprise by my correspondent and myself. On her side, Miss Jillgall was entirely ignorant that one of the two girls was not Mr. Greystow's daughter, but his adopted child. On my side, I was entirely ignorant of Mrs. Tenbruggen's purpose in endeavoring to identify the daughter of the murderess. Speaking of myself, individually, let me add that I only waited the event to protect the helpless ones, my poor demented friend, and the orphan whom his mercy received into his heart and his home. Miss Jillgall goes on with her curious story as follows. Always desirous of making myself useful, I thought I would give my dear Elizabeth a hint which might save time and trouble. Why not begin, I suggested, by asking the governor to help you? That wonderful woman never forgets anything. She had already applied to you, without success. In my next attempt to be useful, I did violence to my most cherished convictions by presenting the wretch Helena to the admirable Elizabeth. That the former would be cold as ice in her reception of any friend of mine was nothing wonderful. Mrs. Tenbruggen passed it over with the graceful composure of a woman of the world. In the course of conversation with Helena, she slipped in a question. "Might I ask if you were older than your sister?" The answer was, of course, "I don't know." And here, for once, the most deceitful girl in existence, spoke the truth. When we were alone again, Elizabeth made a remark. "If personal appearance could decide the question," she said, "the disagreeable young woman is the oldest of the two. The next thing to be done is to discover if looks are to be trusted in this case." My friend's lawyer received confidential instructions, not shown to me, which seems rather hard, to trace the two Miss Greystew's registers of birth. Elizabeth described this proceeding, not very intelligibly to my mind, as a means of finding out which of the girls could be identified by name as the elder of the two. The report arrived this morning. I was only informed that the result, in one case, had entirely defeated the inquiries. In the other case, Elizabeth had helped her agent by referring him to a birth, advertised in the customary columns of the Times newspaper. Even here there was a fatal obstacle. The name of the place in which Mr. Greystew's daughter had been born was not added, as usual. I still tried to be useful. Had my friend known the minister's wife? My friend had never even seen the minister's wife, and, as if by a fatality, her portrait was no longer in existence. I could only mention that Helena was like her mother. But Elizabeth seemed to attach very little importance to my evidence, if I may call it by so grand a name. "People have such strange ideas about likenesses," she said, "and arrive at such contradictory conclusions. One can only trust one's own eyes in a matter of that kind." My friend next asked me about our domestic establishment. We had only a cook and a housemaid. If they were old servants who had known the girls as children, they might be made of some use. Our luck was as steadily against us as ever. They had both been engaged when Mr. Greystew assumed his new pastoral duties, after having resided with his wife at her native place. I asked Elizabeth what she proposed to do next. She deferred her answer until I had first told her whether the visit of the doctor might be expected on that day. I could reply to this in the negative. Elizabeth, thereupon, made a startling request. She begged me to introduce her to Mr. Greystew. I said, "Surely you have forgotten the sad state of his mind." No, she knew perfectly well that he was imbecile. "I want to try," she explained, "if I can rouse him for a few minutes." "By massage?" I inquired. She burst out laughing. "Massage, my dear, doesn't act in that way. It is an elaborate process, pursued patiently for weeks together. But my hands have more than one accomplishment at their finger ends. Oh, make your mind easy. I shall do no harm, if I do no good. Take me, Selina, to the minister." We went to his room. Don't blame me for giving way. I am too fond of Elizabeth to be able to disappoint her. It was a sad sight when we went in. He was quite happy, playing like a child at cup and ball. The attendant retired at my request. I introduced Mrs. Tenbruggen. He smiled and shook hands with her. He said, "Are you a Christian or a pagan? You are very pretty. How many times can you catch the ball in the cup?" The effort to talk to her ended there. He went on with his game, and seemed to forget that there was anybody in the room. It made my heart ache to remember what he was, and to see him now. Elizabeth whispered, "Leave me alone with him." I don't know why I did such a rude thing. I hesitated. Elizabeth asked me if I had no confidence in her. I was ashamed of myself. I left them together. A long half-hour passed. Feeling a little uneasy, I went upstairs again and looked into the room. He was leaning back in his chair. His plaything was on the floor, and he was looking vacantly at the light that came in through the window. I found Mrs. Tenbruggen at the other end of the room, in the act of ringing the bell. Nothing in the least out of the ordinary way seemed to have happened. When the attendant had answered the bell, we left the room together. Mr. Gracedieu took no notice of us. "Well," I said, "how has it ended?" Quite calmly my noble Elizabeth answered, "In total failure." "What did you say to him after you sent me away?" "I tried in every possible way to get him to tell me which of his 2 daughters was the oldest." "Did he refuse to answer?" "He was only too ready to answer. First he said Helena was the oldest. Then he corrected himself and declared that Eunice was the oldest. Then he said they were twins. Then he went back to Helena and Eunice. Now one was the oldest and now the other. He rang the changes on those 2 names, I can't tell you how often, and seemed to think it a better game than cup and ball." "What is to be done?" "Nothing is to be done, Selina." "What?" I cried. "You give it up?" My heroic friend answered, "I know when I am beaten, my dear. I give it up." She looked at her watch. It was time to operate on the muscles of one of her patients. Away she went, on her glorious mission of massage, without a murmur of regret. What strength of mind! But, oh dear, what a disappointment for poor little me! On one thing I am determined. If I find myself getting puzzled or frightened, I shall instantly write to you. With that expression of confidence in me, Selina's narrative came to an end. I wish I could have believed, as she did, that the object of her admiration had been telling her the truth. A few days later, Mrs. Tenbruggen honored me with a visit at my house in the neighborhood of London. Thanks to this circumstance, I am able to add a postscript which will complete the revelations in Miss Jillgall's letter. The illustrious masseuse, having much to conceal from her faithful Selina, was well aware that she had only one thing to keep hidden from me, namely, the advantage which she would have gained if her inquiries had met with success. "I thought I might have got what I wanted," she told me, "by mesmerizing our reverend friend. He is as weak as a woman. I threw him into hysterics, and had to give it up and quiet him, or he would have alarmed the house. You look as if you don't believe in mesmerism." "My looks, Mrs. Tenbruggen, exactly express my opinion. Mesmerism is a humbug." "You amusing old Tory! Shall I throw you into a state of trance? No, I'll give you a shock of another kind, a shock of surprise. I know as much as you do about Mr. Gracedieu's daughters. What do you think of that?" "I think I should like to hear you tell me which is the adopted child." "Helena, to be sure." Her manner was defiant, her tone was positive. I doubted both. Under the surface of her assumed confidence, I saw something which told me that she was trying to read my thoughts in my face. Many other women had tried to do that. They succeeded when I was young. When I reached the wrong side of 50, my face had learned discretion, and they failed. "How did you arrive at your discovery?" I asked. "I know of nobody who could have helped you." "I helped myself, sir. I reasoned it out. A wonderful thing for a woman to do, isn't it? I wonder whether you could follow the process." My reply to this was made by a bow. I was sure of my command over my face, but perfect control of the voice is a rare power. Here and there a great actor or a great criminal possesses it. Mrs. Tenbruggen's vanity took me into her confidence. "In the first place," she said, "Helena is plainly the wicked one of the two. I was not prejudiced by what Selina had told me of her. I saw it and felt it before I had been 5 minutes in her company. If lying tongues ever provoke her, as lying tongues provoked her mother, she will follow her mother's example. Very well. Now, in the second place, though it is very slight, there is a certain something in her hair and her complexion which reminds me of the murderess. There is no other resemblance, I admit. In the third place, the girls' names point to the same conclusion. Mr. Gracedieu is a Protestant and a dissenter. Would he call a child of his own by the name of a Roman Catholic saint? No, he would prefer a name in the Bible. Eunice is his child, and Helena was once the baby whom I carried into the prison. Do you deny that?" I don't deny it. Only 4 words, but they were deceitfully spoken, and the deceit, practiced in Eunice's interest, it is needless to say, succeeded. Mrs. Tenbruggen's object in visiting me was attained. I had confirmed her belief in the delusion that Helena was the adopted child. She got up to take her leave. I asked if she proposed remaining in London. No, she was returning to her country patients that night. As I attended her to the house door, she turned to me with her mischievous smile. "I have taken some trouble in finding the clue to the minister's mystery," she said. "Don't you wonder why?" "If I did wonder," I answered, "would you tell me why?" She laughed at the bare idea of it. "Another lesson," she said, "to assist a helpless man in studying the weaker sex. I have already shown you that a woman can reason. Learn next that a woman can keep a secret. Good-bye. God bless you." Of the events which followed Mrs. Tenbruggen's visit, it is not possible for me, I am thankful to say, to speak from personal experience. Ought I to conclude with an expression of repentance for the act of deception to which I have already pleaded guilty? I don't know. Yes, the force of circumstances does really compel me to say it, and say it seriously. I declare, on my word of honor, I don't know.
Chapter 52 of the Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 52. Helena's diary resumed. While my father remains in his present helpless condition, somebody must assume a position of command in this house. There cannot be a moment's doubt that I am the person to do it. In my agitated state of mind, sometimes doubtful of Philip, sometimes hopeful of him, I find Mrs. Tenbruggen simply unendurable. A female doctor is, under any circumstances, a creature whom I detest. She is, at her very best, a bad imitation of a man. The medical rubber is worse than this. She is a bad imitation of a mountebank. Her grinning good humour, adopted no doubt to please the fools who are her patients, and her impudent enjoyment of hearing herself talk, make me regret for the first time in my life that I am a young lady. If I belonged to the lowest order of the population, I might take the first stick I could find, and enjoy the luxury of giving Mrs. Tenbruggen a good beating. She literally haunts the house, encouraged, of course, by her wretched little dupe, Miss Jillgall. Only this morning I tried what a broad hint would do, toward suggesting that her visits had better come to an end. "Really, Mrs. Tenbruggen," I said, "I must request Miss Jillgall to moderate her selfish enjoyment of your company, for your own sake. Your time is too valuable, in a professional sense, to be wasted on an idle woman who has no sympathy with your patients, waiting for relief, perhaps, and waiting in vain." She listened to this, all smiles and good humour. "My dear, do you know how I might answer you, if I was an ill-natured woman?" "I have no curiosity to hear it, Mrs. Tenbruggen." "I might ask you," she persisted, "to allow me to mind my own business. But I am incapable of making an ungrateful return for the interest which you take in my medical welfare. Let me venture to ask if you understand the value of time." "Are you going to say much more, Mrs. Tenbruggen?" "I am going to make a sensible remark, my child. If you feel tired, permit me. Here is a chair. Father Time, dear Miss Gracedieu, has always been a good friend of mine, because I know how to make the best use of him. The author of the famous saying, Tempus fugit, you understand Latin, of course, was, I take leave to think, an idle man. The more I have to do, the readier time is to wait for me. Let me impress this on your mind by some interesting examples. The greatest conqueror of the century, Napoleon, had time enough for everything. The greatest novelist of the century, Sir Walter Scott, had time enough for everything. At my humble distance I imitate those illustrious men, and my patients never complain of me. "Have you done?" I asked. "Yes, dear, for the present." "You are a clever woman, Mrs. Tenbruggen, and you know it. You have an eloquent tongue, and you know it. But you are something else which you don't seem to be aware of. You are a bore." She burst out laughing, with the air of a woman who thoroughly enjoyed a good joke. I looked back when I left the room, and I saw the friend of Father Time in the easy chair opening our newspaper. This is a specimen of the customary encounter of our wits. I place it on record in my journal to excuse myself to myself. When she left us at last, later in the day, I sent a letter after her to the hotel. Not having kept a copy of it, let me present the substance, like a sermon, under 3 heads. I begged to be excused for speaking plainly. I declared that there was a total want of sympathy between us, on my side, and I proposed that she should deprive me of future opportunities of receiving her in this house. The letter arrived immediately in these terms: "Your letter received, dear girl. I am not in the least angry, partly because I am very fond of you, partly because I know that you will ask me to come back again. P.S. Philip sends his love." This last piece of insolence was unquestionably a lie. Philip detests her. They are both staying at the same hotel, but I happen to know that he won't even look at her if they meet by accident on the stairs. People who can enjoy the melancholy spectacle of human nature in a state of degradation would be at a loss which exhibition to prefer, an ugly old maid in a rage, or an ugly old maid in tears. Miss Jillgall presented herself in both characters when she heard what had happened. To my mind, Mrs. Tenbruggen's bosom friend is a creature not fit to be seen or heard when she loses her temper. I only told her to leave the room. To my great amusement, she shook her bony fist at me, and expressed a frantic wish. "Oh, if I was rich enough to leave this wicked house!" I wonder whether there is insanity as well as poverty in Miss Jillgall's family. Last night my mind was in a harassed state. Philip was, as usual, the cause of it. Perhaps I acted indiscreetly when I insisted on his leaving London and returning to this place. But what else could I have done? It was not merely my interest, it was an act of downright necessity to withdraw him from the influence of his hateful father, whom I now regard as the one serious obstacle to my marriage. There is no prospect of being rid of Mr. Dunboyne the elder by his returning to Ireland. He is trying a new remedy for his crippled hand, electricity. I wish it was lightning to kill him. If I had given that wicked old man the chance, I am firmly convinced he would not have let a day pass without doing his best to depreciate me in his son's estimation. Besides, there was the risk, if I had allowed Philip to remain long away from me, of losing— No, while I keep my beauty, I cannot be in such danger as that. Let me say, of permitting time and absence to weaken my hold on him. However sullen and silent he may be when we meet, and I find him in that condition far too often, I can, sooner or later, recall him to his brighter self. My eyes preserve their charm, my talk can still amuse him, and, better even than that, I feel the answering thrill in him which tells me how precious my kisses are, not too lavishly bestowed. But the time when I am obliged to leave him to himself is the time that I dread. How do I know that his thoughts are not wandering away to Eunice? He denies it. He declares that he only went to the farmhouse to express his regret for his thoughtless conduct, and to offer her the brotherly regard due to the sister of his promised wife. Can I believe it? Oh, what I would not give to be able to believe it! How can I feel sure that her refusal to see him was not a cunning device to make him long for another interview, and plan, perhaps, in private, to go back and try again? Marriage! Nothing will quiet these frightful doubts of mine. Nothing will reward me for all that I have suffered. Nothing will warm my heart with the delightful sense of triumph over Eunice, but my marriage to Philip. And what does he say when I urge it on him? Yes, I have fallen as low as that, in the despair which sometimes possesses me. He has his answer, always the same, and always ready. How are we to live? Where is the money? The maddening part of it is that I cannot accuse him of raising objections that don't exist. We are poorer than ever here, since my father's illness, and Philip's allowance is barely enough to suffice him as a single man. Oh, how I hate the rich! It was useless to think of going to bed. How could I hope to sleep, with my head throbbing and my thoughts in this disturbed state? I put on my comfortable dressing gown, and sat down to try what reading would do to quiet my mind. I had borrowed the book from the library, to which I have been a subscriber in secret for some time past. It was an old volume, full of what we should now call gossip, relating strange adventures and scandalous incidents in family history which had been concealed from public notice. One of these last romances in real life caught a strong hold on my interest. It was a strange case of intended poisoning, which had never been carried out. A young married lady of rank, whose name was concealed under an initial letter, had suffered some unendurable wrong, which was not mentioned, at the hands of her husband's mother. The wife was described as a woman of strong passions, who had determined on a terrible revenge by taking the life of her mother-in-law. There were difficulties in the way of her committing the crime without an accomplice to help her, and she decided on taking her maid, an elderly woman, into her confidence. The poison was secretly obtained by this person, and the safest manner of administering it was under discussion between the mistress and the maid, when the door of the room was suddenly opened. The husband, accompanied by his brother, rushed in, and charged his wife with plotting the murder of his mother. The young lady, she was only 23, must have been a person of extraordinary courage and resolution. She saw at once that her maid had betrayed her, and, with astonishing presence of mind, she turned on the traitress, and said to her husband, "There is the wretch who has been trying to persuade me to poison your mother." As it happened, the old lady's temper was violent and overbearing, and the maid had complained of being ill-treated by her in the hearing of the other servants. The circumstances made it impossible to decide which of the two was really the guilty woman. The servant was sent away, and the husband and wife separated soon afterward, under the excuse of incompatibility of temper. Years passed, and the truth was only discovered by the deathbed confession of the wife. A remarkable story, which has made such an impression on me that I have written it in my journal. I am not rich enough to buy the book. For the last 2 days I have been confined to my room with a bad feverish cold, caught, as I suppose, by sitting at an open window reading my book till nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. I sent a note to Philip, telling him of my illness. On the first day he called to inquire after me. On the second day, no visit and no letter. Here is the third day, and no news of him as yet. I am better, but not fit to go out. Let me wait another hour, and if that exertion of patience meets with no reward, I shall send a note to the hotel. No news of Philip. I have sent to the hotel. The servant has just returned, bringing me back my note. The waiter informed her that Mr. Dunboyne had gone away to London by the morning train. No apology or explanation left for me. Can he have deserted me? I am in such a frenzy of doubt and rage that I can hardly write that horrible question. Is it possible? Oh, I feel it is possible that he has gone away with Eunice. Do I know where to find them? If I did know, what could I do? Chapter 53 of the Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 53. Helena's Diary Resumed. After the heat of my anger had cooled, I made 2 discoveries. One cost me a fee to a messenger, and the other exposed me to the insolence of a servant. I pay willingly in my purse and my pride, when the gain is peace of mind. Through my messenger I ascertained that Eunice had never left the farm. Through my own inquiries, answered by the waiter with an impudent grin, I heard that Philip had left orders to have his room kept for him. What misery our stupid housemaid might have spared me if she had thought of putting that question when I sent her to the hotel. The rest of the day passed in vain speculations on Philip's motive for this sudden departure. What poor weak creatures we are! I persuaded myself to hope that anxiety for our marriage had urged him to make an effort to touch the heart of his mean father. Shall I see him tomorrow? And shall I have reason to be fonder of him than ever? We met again today, as usual. He has behaved infamously. When I asked what had been his object in going to London, I was told that it was a matter of business. He made that idiotic excuse as coolly as if he really thought I should believe it. I submitted in silence, rather than mar his return to me by the disaster of a quarrel. But this was an unlucky day. a harder trial of my self-control was still to come. Without the slightest appearance of shame, Philip informed me that he was charged with a message from Mrs. Tenbruggen. She wanted some Irish lace, and would I be so good as to tell her which was the best shop at which she could buy it? Was he really in earnest? You, I said, who distrusted and detested her, you are on friendly terms with that woman? He remonstrated with me. My dear Helena, don't speak in that way of Mrs. Tenbruggen. We have both been mistaken about her. That good creature has forgiven the brutal manner in which I spoke to her when she was in attendance on my father. She was the first to propose that we should shake hands and forget it. My darling, don't let all the good feeling be on one side. You have no idea how kindly she speaks of you, and how anxious she is to help us to be married. Come, meet her halfway. Write down the name of the shop on my card, and I will take it back to her." Sheer amazement kept me silent. I let him go on. He was a mere child in the hands of Mrs. Tenbruggen. She had only to determine to make a fool of him, and she could do it. But why did she do it? What advantage had she to gain by insinuating herself in this way into his good opinion, evidently with the intention of urging him to reconcile us to each other? How could we two poor young people be of the smallest use to the fashionable masseuse? My silence began to irritate Philip. "I never knew before how obstinate you could be," he said. "You seem to be doing your best, I can't imagine why, to lower yourself in my estimation." I held my tongue. I assumed my smile. It is all very well for men to talk about the deceitfulness of women. What chance, I should like to ask somebody who knows about it, do the men give us of making our lives with them endurable, except by deceit? I gave way, of course, and wrote down the address of the shop. He was so pleased that he kissed me. Yes, the most fondly affectionate kiss that he had given me for weeks past was my reward for submitting to Mrs. Tenbruggen. She is old enough to be his mother, and almost as ugly as Miss Jillgall, and she has made her interests his interests already. On the next day I fully expected to receive a visit from Mrs. Tenbruggen. She knew better than that. I only got a polite little note, thanking me for the address, and adding an artless concession. I earn more money than I know what to do with, and I adore Irish lace. The next day came, and still she was careful not to show herself too eager for a personal reconciliation. A splendid nosegay was sent to me, with another little note. "A tribute, dear Helena, offered by one of my grateful patients. Too beautiful a present for an old woman like me. I agree with the poet, 'Sweets to the sweet.' A charming thought of Shakespeare's, is it not? I should like to verify the quotation. Would you mind leaving the volume for me in the hall, if I call tomorrow?" Well done, Mrs. Tenbruggen! She doesn't venture to intrude on Miss Gracedieu in the drawing room; she only wants to verify a quotation in the hall. O goddess of humility, if there is such a person, how becomingly you are dressed when your milliner is an artful old woman! While this reflection was passing through my mind, Miss Jillgall came in, saw the nosegay on the table, and instantly pounced on it. "Oh, for me!" she cried. "I noticed it this morning on Elizabeth's table. How very kind of her!" She plunged her inquisitive nose into the poor flowers, and looked up sentimentally at the ceiling. "The perfume of goodness," she remarked, "mingled with the perfume of flowers." "When you have quite done with it," I said, "perhaps you will be so good as to return my nosegay?" "Your nosegay!" she exclaimed. "There is Mrs. Tenbruggen's letter," I replied, "if you would like to look at it." She did look at it. All the bile in her body flew up into her eyes, and turned them green. She looked as if she longed to scratch my face. I gave the flowers afterward to Maria. Miss Jillgall's nose had completely spoiled them. It would have been too ridiculous to have allowed Mrs. Tenbruggen to consult Shakespeare in the hall. I had the honor of receiving her in my own room. We accomplished a touching reconciliation, and we quite forgot Shakespeare. She troubles me. She does indeed trouble me. Having set herself entirely right with Philip, she is determined on performing the same miracle with me. Her reform of herself is already complete. Her vulgar humour was kept under strict restraint. She was quiet and well bred, and readier to listen than to talk. This change was not presented abruptly. She contrived to express her friendly interests in Philip and me by hints dropped here and there, assisted in their efforts by answers on my part, into which I was tempted so skilfully that I only discovered the snare set for me on reflection. What is it, I ask again, that she has in view in taking all this trouble? Where is her motive for encouraging a love affair, which Miss Jillgall must have denounced to her as an abominable wrong inflicted on Eunice? Money, even if there was a prospect of such a thing in our case, cannot be her object. It is quite true that her success sets her above pecuniary anxiety. Spiteful feeling against Eunice is out of the question. They have only met once, and her opinion was expressed to me with evident sincerity. Your sister is a nice girl, but she is like other nice girls. She doesn't interest me. There is Eunice's character, drawn from life in few words. In what an irritating position do I find myself placed! Never before have I felt so interested in trying to look into a person's secret mind, and never before have I been so completely baffled. I had written as far as this, and was on the point of closing my journal, when a third note arrived from Mrs. Tenbruggen. She had been thinking about me at intervals, she wrote, all through the rest of the day, and, kindly as I had received her, she was conscious of being the object of doubts on my part, which her visit had failed to remove. Might she ask leave to call on me, in the hope of improving her position in my estimation? An appointment followed for the next day. What can she Chapter 54 of the Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 54. Helena's Diary Resumed. At our interview of the next day, Mrs. Tenbruggen's capacity for self-reform appeared under a new aspect. She dropped all familiarity with me, and she stated the object of her visit without a superfluous word of explanation or apology. I thought this a remarkable effort for a woman, and I recognized the merit of it by leaving the lion's share of the talk to my visitor. In these terms she opened her business with me. "Has Mr. Philip Dunboyne told you why he went to London?" "He made a commonplace excuse," I answered. "Business, he said, took him to London. I know no more." "You have a fair prospect of happiness, Miss Helena, when you are married. Your future husband is evidently afraid of you. I am not afraid of you, and I shall confide to your private ear something which you have an interest in knowing. The business which took young Mr. Dunboyne to London was to consult a competent person on a matter concerning himself. The competent person is the sagacious, not to say sly, old gentleman whom we used to call the Governor. You know him, I believe." "Yes, but I am at a loss to imagine why Philip should have consulted him." "Have you ever heard or read, Miss Helena, of such a thing as an old man's fancy?" "I think I have." "Well, the Governor has taken an old man's fancy to your sister. They appeared to understand each other perfectly when I was at the farmhouse." "Excuse me, Mrs. Tenbruggen, that is what I know already. Why did Philip go to the Governor?" She smiled. "If anybody is acquainted with the true state of your sister's feelings, the Governor is the man. I sent Mr. Dunboyne to consult him, and there is the reason for it." This open avowal of her motives perplexed and offended me. After declaring herself to be interested in my marriage engagement, had she changed her mind, and resolved on favoring Philip's return to Eunice? What right had he to consult anybody about the state of that girl's feelings? My feelings formed the only subject of inquiry that was properly open to him. I should have said something which I might have afterwards regretted, if Mrs. Tenbruggen had allowed me the opportunity. Fortunately for both of us, she went on with her narrative of her own proceedings. "Philip Dunboyne is an excellent fellow," she continued. "I really like him, but he has his faults. He sadly wants strength of purpose, and, like weak men in general, he only knows his own mind when a resolute friend takes him in hand and guides him. I am his resolute friend. I saw him veering about between you and Eunice, and I decided for his sake, may I say for your sake also, on putting an end to that mischievous state of indecision. You have the claim on him, you are the right wife for him, and the Governor was, as I thought likely from what I had myself observed, the man to make him see it. I am not in anybody's secrets, it was pure guesswork on my part, and it has succeeded. There is no more doubt now about Miss Eunice's sentiments. The question is settled." "In my favor?" "Certainly in your favor, or I should not have said a word about it." "Was Philip's visit kindly received, or did the old wretch laugh at him?" "My dear Miss Gracedieu, the old wretch is a man of the world, and never makes mistakes of that sort. Before he could open his lips, he had to satisfy himself that your lover deserved to be taken into his confidence on the delicate subject of Eunice's sentiments. He arrived at a favorable conclusion. I can repeat Philip's questions and the Governor's answers, after putting the young man through a stiff examination, just as they passed. May I inquire, sir, if she has spoken to you about me?" "She has often spoken about you." "Did she seem to be angry with me?" "She is too good and too sweet to be angry with you." "Do you think she will forgive me?" "She has forgiven you." "Did she say so herself?" "Yes, of her own free will." "Why did she refuse to see me when I called at the farm?" "She had her own reasons, good reasons." "Has she regretted it since?" "Certainly not." "Is it likely that she would consent if I proposed a reconciliation?" "I put that question to her myself." "How did she take it, sir?" "She declined to take it." "You mean that she has declined a reconciliation?" "Yes." "Are you sure she was in earnest?" "I am positively sure." That last answer seems, by young Dunboyne's own confession, to have been enough, and more than enough, for him. He got up to go, and then an odd thing happened. After giving him the most unfavorable answers, the Governor patted him paternally on the shoulder, and encouraged him to hope. Before we say good bye, Mr. Philip, one word more. If I was as young as you are, I should not despair. There is a sudden change of front. Who can explain it?" The Governor's mischievous resolution to reconcile Philip and Eunice explained it, of course. With the best intentions, perhaps, Mrs. Tenbruggen had helped that design by bringing the two men together. "Go on," I said. "I am prepared to hear next that Philip has paid another visit to my sister, and has been received this time." I must say this for Mrs. Tenbruggen: she kept her temper perfectly. "He has not been to the farm," she said, "but he has done something nearly as foolish. He has written to your sister." "And he has received a favorable reply, of course?" She put her hand into the pocket of her dress. "There is your sister's reply," she said. Any persons who have had a crushing burden lifted, unexpectedly and instantly, from off their minds, will know what I felt when I read the reply. In the most positive language, Eunice refused to correspond with Philip or to speak with him. The concluding words proved that she was in earnest. "You are engaged to Helena. Consider me as a stranger until you are married. After that time you will be my brother in law, and then I may pardon you for writing to me." Nobody who knows Eunice would have supposed that she possessed those two valuable qualities, common sense and proper pride. It is pleasant to feel that I can now send cards to my sister when I am Mrs. Philip Dunboyne. I returned the letter to Mrs. Tenbruggen with the sincerest expressions of regret for having doubted her. "I have been unworthy of your generous interest in me," I said. "I am almost ashamed to offer you my hand." She took my hand and gave it a good heady shake. "Are we friends?" she asked, in the simplest and prettiest manner. "Then let us be easy and pleasant again," she went on. "Will you call me Elizabeth, and shall I call you Helena?" "Very well. Now I have got something else to say, another secret which must be kept from Philip. I call him by his name now, you see, for a few days more. Your happiness, my dear, must not depend on his miserly old father. He must have a little income of his own to marry on. Among the hundreds of unfortunate wretches whom I have relieved from torture of mind and body, there is a grateful minority. Small, but there they are. I have influence among powerful people, and I am trying to make Philip private secretary to a member of Parliament. When I have succeeded, you shall tell him the good news." What a vile humor I must have been in at the time, not to have appreciated the delightful gaiety of this good creature! I went to the other extreme now, and behaved like a gushing young miss fresh from school. I kissed her. She burst out laughing. "What a sacrifice!" she cried. "A kiss for me, which ought to have been kept for Philip. By the by, do you know what I should do, Helena, in your place? I should take our handsome young man away from that hotel." "I will do anything that you advise," I said. "And you will do well, my child. In the first place, the hotel is too expensive for Philip's small means. In the second place, two of the chambermaids have audaciously presumed to be charming girls, and the men, my dear, well, I will leave you to find that out for yourself. In the third place, you want to have Philip under your own wing. Domestic familiarity will make him fonder of you than ever. Keep him out of the sort of company that he meets with in the billiard room and the smoking room. You have got a spare bed here, I know, and your poor father is in no condition to use his authority. Make Philip one of the family." This last piece of advice staggered me. I mentioned the proprieties. Mrs. Tenbruggen laughed at the proprieties. "Make Selina of some use," she suggested. "While you have got her in the house, propriety is rampant. Why condemn poor helpless Philip to cheap lodgings? Time enough to cast him out to the feather bed and the fleas on the night before your marriage. Besides, I shall be in and out constantly, for I mean to cure your father. The tongue of scandal is silent in my Chapter 55 of the Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 55. Helena's Diary resumed. I did think of it. Philip came to us and lived in our house. Let me hasten to add that the protest of propriety was duly entered on the day before my promised husband arrived. Standing in the doorway, nothing would induce her to take a chair or even to enter the room, Miss Jillgall delivered her opinion on Philip's approaching visit. Mrs. Tenbruggen reported it in her pocket-book, as if she was representing a newspaper at a public meeting. Here it is, copied from her notes. Miss Helena Gracedieu, my first impulse under the present disgusting circumstances was to leave the house and earn a bare crust in the cheapest garret I could find in the town. But my grateful heart remembers Mr. Gracedieu. My poor afflicted cousin was good to me when I was helpless. I cannot forsake him when he is helpless. At whatever sacrifice of my own self-respect, I remain under this roof, so dear to me for the minister's sake. I notice, miss, that you smile. I see my once dear Elizabeth, the friend who has so bitterly disappointed me." She stopped and put her handkerchief to her eyes, and went on again. "My friend who has so bitterly disappointed me, taking satirical notes of what I say. I am not ashamed of what I say. The virtue which will not stretch a little, where motive is good, is feeble virtue indeed. I shall stay in the house, and witness horrors, and rise superior to them. Good morning, Miss Gracedieu. Good morning, Elizabeth." She performed a magnificent curtsey, and, as Mrs. Tenbruggen's experience of the stage informed me, made a very creditable exit. A week has passed, and I have not opened my diary. My days have glided away in one delicious flow of happiness. Philip has been delightfully devoted to me. His fervent courtship, far exceeding any similar attentions which he may once have paid to Eunice, have shown such variety and such steadfastness of worship that I despair of describing it. My enjoyment of my new life is to be felt, not to be coldly considered, and reduced to an imperfect statement in words. For the first time I feel capable, if the circumstances encouraged me, of acts of exalted virtue. For instance, I could save my country, if my country was worth it. I could die a martyr to religion, if I had a religion. In one word, I am exceedingly well satisfied with myself. The little disappointments of life pass over me harmless. I do not even regret the failure of good Mrs. Tenbruggen's efforts to find an employment for Philip worthy of his abilities and accomplishments. The member of Parliament to whom she had applied has chosen a secretary possessed of political influence. That is the excuse put forward in his letter to Mrs. Tenbruggen. Wretched, corrupt creature! If he was worth a thought, I should pity him. He has lost Philip's services. 3 days more have slipped by. The aspect of my heaven on earth is beginning to alter. Perhaps the author of that wonderful French novel, Le Mot Damné, is right when he tells us that human happiness is misery in masquerade. It would be wrong to say that I am miserable, but I may be on my way to it. I am anxious. To-day, when he did not know that I was observing him, I discovered a preoccupied look in Philip's eyes. He laughed when I asked if anything had happened to vex him. Was it a natural laugh? He put his arm round me and kissed me. Was it done mechanically? I dare say I am out of humour myself. I think I had a little headache. Morbid, probably. I won't think of it any more. It has occurred to me this morning that he may dislike being left by himself, while I am engaged in my household affairs. If this is the case, intensely as I hate her, utterly as I loathe the idea of putting her in command over my domestic dominions, I shall ask Miss Jillgall to take my place as housekeeper. I was away to-day in the kitchen regions rather longer than usual. When I had done with my worries, Philip was not to be found. Maria, looking out of one of the bedroom windows instead of doing her work, had seen Mr. Dunboyne leave the house. It was possible that he had charged Miss Jillgall with a message for me. I asked if she was in her room. No, she too had gone out. It was a fine day, and Philip had no doubt taken a stroll, but he might have waited till I could join him. There were some orders to be given to the butcher and the greengrocer. I too left the house, hoping to get rid of some little discontent, caused by thinking of what had happened. Returning by way of High Street, I declare I can hardly believe it even now, I did positively see Miss Jillgall coming out of a pawnbroker's shop. The direction in which she turned prevented her from seeing me. She was quite unaware that I had discovered her, and I have said nothing about it since. But I noticed something unusual in the manner in which her watch chain was hanging, and I asked her what o'clock it was. She said, "You have got your own watch." I told her my watch had stopped. "So is mine," she said. There is no doubt about it now, she has pawned her watch. What for? She lives here for nothing, and she has not had a new dress since I have known her. Why does she want money? Philip had not returned when I got home. Another mysterious journey to London? No. After an absence of more than 2 hours, he came back. Naturally enough, I asked what he had been about. He had been taking a long walk. For his health's sake? No, to think. To think of what? Well, I might be surprised to hear it, but his idle life was beginning to weigh on his spirits. He wanted employment. Had he thought of an employment? Not yet. Which way had he walked? Any way, he had not noticed where he went. These replies were all made in a tone that offended me. Besides, I observed there was no dust on his boots, after a week of dry weather, and his walk of 2 hours did not appear to have heated or tired him. I took an opportunity of consulting Mrs. Tenbruggen. She had anticipated that I should appeal to her opinion, as a woman of the world. I shall not set down in detail what she said. Some of it humiliated me, and from some of it I recoiled. The expression of her opinion came to this: in the absence of experience, a certain fervor of temperament was essential to success in the art of fascinating men. Either my temperament was deficient, or my intellect overpowered it. It was natural that I should suppose myself to be as susceptible to the tender passion as the most excitable woman living. Delusion, my Helena, amiable delusion. Had I ever observed, or had any friend told me, that my pretty hands were cold hands? I had beautiful eyes, expressive of vivacity, of intelligence, of every feminine charm, except the one inviting charm that finds favor in the eyes of a man. She then entered into particulars, which I don't deny showed a true interest in helping me. I was ungrateful, sulky, self-opinionated. Dating from that day's talk with Mrs. Tenbruggen, my new friendship began to show signs of having caught a chill. But I did my best to follow her instructions, and failed. It is perhaps true that my temperament is overpowered by my intellect. Or is it possibly truer still that the fire in my heart, when it warms to love, is a fire that burns low? My belief is that I surprised Philip instead of charming him. He responded to my advances, but I felt that it was not done in earnest, not spontaneously. Had I any right to complain? Was I in earnest? Was I spontaneous? We were making love to each other under false pretenses. Oh, what a fool I was to ask for Mrs. Tenbruggen's advice! A humiliating doubt has come to me suddenly. Has his heart been inclining to Eunice again, after such a letter as she has written to him? Impossible! 3 events since yesterday, which I consider, trifling as they may be, intimations of something wrong. First, Miss Jillgall, who at one time was eager to take my place, has refused to relieve me of my housekeeping duties. Secondly, Philip has been absent again on another long walk. Thirdly, when Philip returned, depressed and sulky, I caught Miss Jillgall looking at him with interest and pity visible in her skinny face. What do these things mean? I am beginning to doubt everybody. Not one of them, Philip included, cares for me. But I can frighten them at any rate. Yesterday evening I dropped on the floor as suddenly as if I had been shot. A fit of some sort. The doctor honestly declared that he was at a loss to account for it. He would have laid me under an eternal obligation if he had failed to bring me back to life again. As it is, I am more clever than the doctor. What brought on the fit is well known to me. Rage, furious, overpowering, deadly rage, was the cause. I am now in the cold-blooded state, which can look back at the event as composedly as if it had happened to some other girl. Suppose that girl had let her sweetheart know how much she loved him, as she had never let him know it before. Suppose she opened the door again the instant after she had left the room, eager, poor wretch, to say once more for the 50th time, "My angel, I love you." Suppose she found her angel standing with his back toward her, so that his face was reflected in the glass. And suppose she discovered in that face, so smiling and so sweet when his head had rested on her bosom only the moment before, the most hideous expression of disgust that features can betray. There can be no doubt of it. I had made my poor offering of love to a man who secretly loathed me. I wonder that I survived my sense of my own degradation. Well, I am alive, and I know him in his true character at last. Am I a woman who submits when an outrage is offered to her? What will happen next? Who knows? I am in a fine humor. What I have just written has set me laughing at myself. Helena Gracedieu has one merit at least. She is a very amusing person. I slept last night. This morning I am strong again, calm, wickedly capable of deceiving Mr. Philip Dunboyne, as he has deceived me. He has not the faintest suspicion that I have discovered him. I wish he had courage enough to kill somebody. How I should enjoy hiring the nearest window to the scaffold, and seeing him hanged. Miss Jillgall is in better spirits than ever. She is going to take a little holiday, and the cunning creature makes a mystery of it. Good-bye, Miss Helena. I am going to stay for a day or two with a friend. What friend? Who cares? Last night I was wakeful. In the darkness a daring idea came to me. To-day I have carried out the idea. Something has followed which is well worth entering in my diary. I left the room at the usual hour for attending to my domestic affairs. The obstinate cook did me a service. She was insolent. She wanted to have her own way. I gave her her own way. In less than 5 minutes I was on the watch in the pantry, which has a view of the house door. My hat and my parasol were waiting for me on the table, in case of my going out too. In a few minutes more I heard the door opened. Mr. Philip Dunboyne stepped out. He was going to take another of his long walks. I followed him to the street in which the cabs stand. He hired the first one on the rank, an open chaise, while I kept hidden in a shop door. The moment he started on his drive, I hired a closed cab. "Double your fare," I said to the driver, "whatever it may be, if you follow that chaise cleverly, and do what I tell you." He nodded and winked at me. Chapter 56 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 56. Helena's Diary Resumed. When we had left the town behind us, the coachman began to drive more slowly. In my ignorance, I asked what this change in the pace meant. He pointed with his whip to the open road and to the chaise in the distance. "If we keep too near the gentleman, miss, he has only got to look back, and he'll see we are following him. The safe thing to do is to let the chase get on a bit. We can't lose sight of it out here." I had felt inclined to trust in the driver's experience, and he had already justified my confidence in him. This encouraged me to consult his opinion on a matter of some importance to my present interests. I could see the necessity of avoiding discovery when we had followed the chase to its destination, but I was totally at a loss to know how it could be done. My wily old man was ready with his advice the moment I asked for it. "Wherever the chase stops, miss, we must drive past it as if we are going somewhere else. I shall notice the place while we go by, and you will please sit back in the corner of the cab, so that the gentleman can't see you." "Well," I said, "and what next?" "Next, miss, I shall pull up, wherever it may be, out of sight of the driver of the chaise. He bears an excellent character, I don't deny it, but I've known him for years, and we had better not trust him. I shall tell you where the gentleman stopped, and you will go back to the place, on foot of course, and see for yourself what's to be done, specially if there happens to be a lady in the case. No offence, miss, it's in my experience that there's generally a lady in the case. Anyhow, you can judge for yourself, and you'll know where to find me waiting when you want me again." "Suppose something happens," I suggested, "that we don't expect?" "I shan't lose my head, miss, whatever happens." "All very well, coachman, but I have only your word for it." In the irritable state of my mind, the man's confident way of thinking annoyed me. "Begging your pardon, my young lady, you've got, if I may say so, what they call a guarantee. When I was a young man, I drove a cab in London for 10 years. Will that do?" "I suppose you mean," I answered, "that you have learned deceit in the wicked ways of the great city." He took this as a compliment. "Thank you, miss, that's it exactly." After a long drive, or so it seemed to my impatience, we passed the chaise drawn up at a lonely house, separated by a front garden from the road. In 2 or 3 minutes more we stopped where the road took a turn, and descended to lower ground. The farmhouse, which we had left behind us, was known to the driver. He led the way to a gate at the side of the road, and opened it for me. "In your place, miss," he said, slyly, "the private way back is the way I should wish to take. Try it by the fields. Turn to the right when you have passed the barn, and you'll find yourself at the back of the house." He stopped and looked at his big silver watch. "12:30," he said. "The Chawbacons, I mean the farmhouse servants, miss, will be at their dinner. All in your favor so far. If the dog happens to be loose, don't forget that his name's Grinder. Call him by his name, and pat him before he has time enough to think, and he'll let you be. When you want me, here you'll find me, waiting for orders." I looked back as I crossed the field. The driver was sitting on the gate, smoking his pipe, and the horse was nibbling the grass at the roadside. 2 happy animals, without a burden on their minds. After passing the barn, I saw nothing of the dog. Far or near, no living creature appeared. The servants must have been at dinner, as the coachman had foreseen. Arriving at a wooden fence, I opened a gate in it, and found myself on a bit of waste ground. On my left there was a large duck pond. On my right I saw the fowl house and the pigsties. Before me was a high, impenetrable hedge, and at some distance behind it, an orchard or a garden, as I supposed, filling the intermediate space, rose the back of the house. I made for the shelter of the hedge, in the fear that some one might approach a window and see me. Once sheltered from observation, I might consider what I should do next. It was impossible to doubt that this was the house in which Eunice was living. Neither could I fail to conclude that Philip had tried to persuade her to see him, on those former occasions when he told me he had taken a long walk. As I crouched behind the hedge, I heard voices approaching on the other side of it. At last fortune had befriended me. The person speaking at the moment was Miss Jillgall, and the person who answered her was Philip. "I am afraid, dear Mr. Philip, you don't quite understand my sweet Eunice. Honorable, high-minded, delicate in her feelings, and oh so unselfish. I don't want to alarm you, but when she hears you have been deceiving Helena—" Upon my word, Miss Jillgall, you are so provoking. I have not been deceiving Helena. Haven't I told you what discouraging answers I got when I went to see the governor? Haven't I shown you Eunice's reply to my letter? You can't have forgotten it already. Oh, yes, I have. Why should I remember it? Don't I know poor Eunice was in your mind all the time? You're wrong again. Eunice was not in my mind all the time. I was hurt. I was offended by the cruel manner in which she had treated me. And what was the consequence? So far was I from deceiving Helena, she rose in my estimation by comparison with her sister. Oh, come, Mr. Philip, that won't do. Helena rising in anybody's estimation. Ha, ha, ha! Laugh as much as you like, Miss Jillgall. You won't laugh away the facts. Helena loved me. Helena was true to me. Don't be hard on a poor fellow who is half distracted. What a man finds he can do on one day, he finds he can't do on another. Try to understand that a change does sometimes come over one's feelings. Bless my soul, Mr. Philip, that's just what I have been understanding all the time. I know your mind as well as you know it yourself. You can't forget my sweet Eunice. I tell you I tried to forget her. On my word of honor as a gentleman, I tried to forget her, in justice to Helena. Is it my fault that I failed? Eunice was in my mind, as you said just now. Oh, my friend, for you are my friend, I am sure, persuade her to see me, if it's only for a minute. Was there ever a man's mind in such a state of confusion as this? First I rise in his precious estimation, and Eunice drops. Then Eunice rises, and I drop. Idiot! Mischievous idiot! Even Selina seemed to be disgusted with him when she spoke next. Mr. Philip, you are hard and unreasonable. I have tried to persuade her, and I have made my darling cry. Nothing you can say will induce me to distress her again. Go back, you very undetermined man. Go back to your Helena. Too late. Nonsense. I say too late. If I could have married Helena when I first went to stay in the house, I might have faced the sacrifice. As it is, I can't endure her, and, I tell you this in confidence, she has herself to thank for what has happened. Is that really true? Quite true. Tell me what she did. Oh, don't talk of her. Persuade Eunice to see me. I shall come back again and again and again till you bring her to me. Please don't talk nonsense. If she changes her mind, I will bring her with pleasure. If she still shrinks from it, I regard Eunice's feelings as sacred. Take my advice, don't press her. Leave her time to think of you, and to pity you, and that true heart may be yours again, if you are worthy of it. Worthy of it? What do you mean? Are you quite sure, my young friend, that you won't go back to Helena? Go back to her? I would cut my throat if I thought myself capable of doing it. How did she set you against her? Did the wretch quarrel with you? It might have been better for both of us if she had done that. Oh, her fulsome endearments! What a contrast to the charming modesty of Eunice! If I was rich, I would make it worth the while of the first poor fellow I could find to rid me of Helena by marrying her. I don't like saying such a thing of a woman, but if you will have the truth. Well, Mr. Philip? Chapter 57 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 57. Helena's Diary resumed. So it was all settled between them. Philip is to throw me away like one of his bad cigars, for this unanswerable reason: Helena disgusts me. And he is to persuade Eunice to take my place and be his wife. Yes, if I let him do it. I heard no more of their talk. With this last, worst outrage burning in my memory, I left the place. On my way back to the carriage, the dog met me. Truly a grand creature. I called him by his name, and I patted him. He licked my hand. Something made me speak to him. I said, "If I was to tell you to tear Mr. Philip Dunboyne to pieces, would you do it?" The great good-natured brute held out his paw to shake hands. Well, well, I was not an object of disgust to the dog. But the coachman was startled when he saw me again. He said something, I did not know what it was, and he produced a pocket flask, containing some spirits, I suppose. Perhaps he thought I was going to faint. He little knew me. I told him to drive back to the place at which I had hired the cab, and earn his money. He earned it. On getting home, I found Mrs. Tenbruggen walking up and down the dining room, deep in thought. She was startled when we first confronted each other. "You look dreadfully ill," she said. I answered that I had been out for a little exercise, and had over-fatigued myself, and then changed the subject. "Does my father seem to improve under your treatment?" I asked. "Very far from it, my dear. I promised that I would try what massage would do for him, and I find myself compelled to give it up." "Why?" "It excites him dreadfully." "In what way?" "He has been talking wildly of events in his past life. His brain is in some condition which is beyond my powers of investigation. He pointed to a cabinet in his room, and said his past life was locked up there. I asked if I should unlock it. He shook with fear. He said I should let out the ghost of his dead brother-in-law. Have you any idea of what he meant?" The cabinet was full of old letters. I could tell her that, and could tell her no more. I had never heard of his brother-in-law. Another of his delusions, no doubt. "Did you ever hear him speak," Mrs. Tenbruggen went on, "of a place called Low Lanes?" She waited for my reply to this last inquiry with an appearance of anxiety that surprised me. I had never heard him speak of Low Lanes. "Have you any particular interest in the place?" I asked. "None whatever." She went away to attend on a patient. I retired to my bedroom, and opened my diary. Again and again I read that remarkable story of the intended poisoning, and of the manner in which it had ended. I sat thinking over this romance in real life, till I was interrupted by the announcement of dinner. Mr. Philip Dunboyne had returned. In Miss Jillgall's absence, we were alone at the table. My appetite was gone. I made a pretence of eating, and another pretence of being glad to see my devoted lover. I talked to him in the prettiest manner. As a hypocrite, he thoroughly matched me. He was gallant, he was amusing. If baseness like ours had been punishable by the law, a prison was the right place for both of us. Mrs. Tenbruggen came in again after dinner, still not quite easy about my health. "How flushed you are!" she said. "Let me feel your pulse." I laughed, and left her with Mr. Philip Dunboyne. Passing my father's door, I looked in, anxious to see if he was in the excitable state which Mrs. Tenbruggen had described. Yes, the effect which she had produced on him how, she knows best had not passed away yet. He was still talking. The attendant told me it had gone on for hours together. On my approaching his chair, he called out, "Which are you, Eunice or Helena?" When I had answered him, he beckoned me to come nearer. "I am getting stronger every minute," he said. "We will go traveling to morrow, and see the place where you were born." Where had I been born? He had never told me where. Had he mentioned the place in Mrs. Tenbruggen's hearing? I asked the attendant if he had been present while she was in the room. Yes, he had remained at his post. He had also heard the allusion to the place with the odd name. Had Mr. Gracedieu said anything more about that place? Nothing more. The poor minister's mind had wandered off to other things. He was wandering now. Sometimes he was addressing his congregation. Sometimes he wondered what they could give him for supper. Sometimes he talked of the flowers in the garden. And then he looked at me and frowned and said I prevented him from thinking. I went back to my bedroom and opened my diary, and read the story again. Was the poison of which that resolute young wife proposed to make use something that acted slowly, and told the doctors nothing if they looked for it after death? Would it be running too great a risk to show the story to the doctor, and try to get a little valuable information in that way? It would be useless. He would make some feeble joke. He would say, "Girls and poisons are not fit company for each other." But I might discover what I want to know in another way. I might call on the doctor after he has gone out on his afternoon round of visits, and might tell the servant I would wait for his master's return. Nobody would be in my way. I might get at the medical literature in the consulting room, and find the information for myself. A knock at my door interrupted me in the midst of my plans. Mrs. Tenbruggen again, still in a fidgety state of feeling on the subject of my health. "Which is it?" she said. "Pain of body, my dear, or pain of mind? I am anxious about you." "My dear Elizabeth, your sympathy is thrown away on me. As I have told you already, I am overtired, nothing more." She was relieved to hear that I had no mental troubles to complain of. "Fatigue," she remarked, "sets itself right with rest. Did you take a very long walk?" "Yes." "Beyond the limits of the town, of course? Philip has been taking a walk in the country, too. He doesn't say that he met you." These clever people sometimes overreach themselves. How she suggested it to me, I cannot pretend to have discovered; but I did certainly suspect that she had led Philip, while they were together downstairs, into saying to her what he had already said to Miss Jillgall. I was so angry that I tried to pump my excellent friend, as she had been trying to pump me. A vulgar expression, but vulgar writing is such a convenient way of writing sometimes. My first attempt to entrap the masseuse failed completely. She coolly changed the subject. "Have I interrupted you in writing?" she asked, pointing to my diary. "No, I was idling over what I had written already, an extraordinary story which I copied from a book." "May I look at it?" I pushed the open diary across the table. If I was the object of any suspicions which she wanted to confirm, it would be curious to see if the poisoning story helped her. "It's a piece of family history," I said. "I think you will agree with me that it is really interesting." She began to read. As she went on, not all her power of controlling herself could prevent her from turning pale. This change of color, in such a woman, a little alarmed me. When a girl is devoured by deadly hatred of a man, does the feeling show itself to other persons in her face? I must practice before the glass, and train my face into a trustworthy state of discipline. "Coarse melodrama," Mrs. Tenbruggen declared. "Mere sensation. No analysis of character. A made-up story." "Well made up, surely," I answered. "I don't agree with you." Her voice was not quite so steady as usual. She asked suddenly if my clock was right, and declared that she should be late for an appointment. On taking leave, she pressed my hand strongly, eyed me with distrustful attention, and said, very emphatically, "Take care of yourself, Helena. Pray take care of yourself." I am afraid I did a very foolish thing when I showed her the poisoning story. Has it helped the wily old creature to look into my inmost thoughts? Impossible! To-day Miss Jillgall returned, looking hideously healthy and spitefully cheerful. Although she tried to conceal it, while I was present, I could see that Philip had recovered his place in her favor. After what he had said to her behind the hedge at the farm, she would be relieved from all fear of my becoming his wife, and would joyfully anticipate his marriage to Eunice. There are thoughts in me which I don't set down in my book. I only say, we shall see. This afternoon I decided on visiting the doctor. The servant was quite sorry for me when he answered the door. His master had just left the house for a round of visits. I said I would wait. The servant was afraid I should find waiting very tedious. I reminded him that I could go away if I found it tedious. At last the polite old man left me. I went into the consulting room and read the backs of the medical books ranged round the walls, and found a volume that interested me. There was such curious information in it that I amused myself by making extracts, using the first sheets of paper that I could find. They had printed directions at the top, which showed that the doctor was accustomed to write his prescriptions on them. We had many, too many, of his prescriptions in our house. The servant's doubts of my patience proved to have been well founded. I got tired of waiting, and went home before the doctor returned. From morning to night, nothing has been seen of Mrs. Tenbruggen to-day, nor has any apology for her neglect of us been received, fond as she is of writing little notes. Has that story in my diary driven her away? Let me see what tomorrow may bring forth. To-day has brought forth nothing. Mrs. Tenbruggen still keeps away from us. It looks as if my diary had something to do with the mystery of her absence. I am not in good spirits to-day. My nerves, if I have such things, which is more than I know by my own experience, have been a little shaken by a horrid dream. The medical information, which my thirst for knowledge absorbed in the doctor's consulting room, turned traitor, armed itself with the grotesque horrors of nightmare, and so thoroughly frightened me that I was on the point of being foolish enough to destroy my notes. I thought better of it, and my notes are safe under lock and key. Mr. Philip Dunboyne is trying to pave the way for his flight from this house. He speaks of friends in London, whose interest will help him to find the employment which is the object of his ambition. In a few days more, he said, I shall ask for leave of absence. Instead of looking at me, his eyes wandered to the window, his fingers played restlessly with his watch-chain while he spoke. I thought I would give him a chance, a last chance, of making the atonement that he owes to me. This shows shameful weakness on my part. Does my own resolution startle me, or does the wretch appeal to what? To my pity? It cannot be my love. I am positively sure that I hate him. Well, I am not the first girl who had been an unanswerable riddle to herself. Is there any other motive for your departure? I asked. What other motive can there be? He replied. I put what I had to say to him in plainer words still. Tell me, Philip, are you beginning to wish that you were a free man again? He still prevaricated. Was this because he is afraid of me, or because he is not quite brute enough to insult me to my face? I tried again, for the third and last time. I almost put the words into his mouth. I fancy you have been out of temper lately, I said. You have not been your own kinder and better self. Is this the right interpretation of the change that I think I see in you? He answered, I have not been very well lately. And that is all? Yes, that is all. There was no more to be said. I turned away to leave the room. He followed me to the door. After a momentary hesitation, he made the attempt to kiss me. I only looked at him. He drew back from me in silence. Chapter 58 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 58. Events in the Family Related by Miss Jillgall. Danger. If anything of importance happens, I trust to you to write an account of it and to send the writing to me. I will come to you at once if I see reason to believe that my presence is required. Those lines in your last kind reply to me rouse my courage, dear Mr. Governor, and sharpen the vigilance which has always been one of the strong points in my character. Every suspicious circumstance which occurs in this house will be, so to speak, seized on by my pen, and will find itself, so to speak again, placed on its trial before your unerring judgment. Let the wicked tremble. I mention no names. Taking up my narrative where it came to an end when I last wrote, I have to say a word first on the subject of my discoveries in regard to Philip's movements. The advertisement of a private inquiry office, which I read in a newspaper, put the thing into my head. I provided myself with money to pay the expenses by, I blush while I write it, pawning my watch. This humiliation of my poor self has been rewarded by success. Skilled investigation has proved that our young man has come to his senses again, exactly as I hoped. On each occasion when he was suspiciously absent from the house, he has been followed to the farm. I have been staying there myself for a day or two, in the hope of persuading Eunice to relent. The hope has not yet been realized. But Philip's devotion, assisted by my influence, will yet prevail. Let me not despair. Whether Helena knows positively that she has lost her wicked hold on Philip, I cannot say. It seems hardly possible that she could have made the discovery just yet. The one thing of which I am certain is, that she looks like a fiend. Philip has wisely taken my advice and employed pious fraud. He will get away from the wretch, who has tempted him once and may tempt him again, under pretence of using the interest of his friends in London to find a place under government. He has not been very well for the last day or two, and the execution of our project is in consequence delayed. I have news of Mrs. Tenbruggen, which will, I think, surprise you. She has kept away from us in a most unaccountable manner. I called on her at the hotel, and heard she was engaged with her lawyer. On the next day, she suddenly returned to her old habits, and paid the customary visit. I observed a similar alteration in her state of feeling. She is now coldly civil to Helena, and she asks after Eunice with a maternal interest touching to see. I said to her, "Elizabeth, you appear to have changed your opinion of the two girls since I saw you." She answered, with a delightful candor which reminded me of old times, "Completely." I said, "A woman of your intellectual caliber, dear, doesn't change her mind without a good reason for it." Elizabeth cordially agreed with me. I ventured to be a little more explicit. "You have no doubt made some interesting discovery." Elizabeth agreed again, and I ventured again. "I suppose I may not ask what the discovery is?" "No, Selina, you may not ask." This is curious, but it is nothing to what I have got to tell you next. Just as I was longing to take her to my bosom again as my friend and confidant, Elizabeth has disappeared. And alas, alas! there is a reason for it which no sympathetic person can dispute. I have just received some overwhelming news in the form of a neat parcel addressed to myself. There has been a scandal at the hotel. That monster in human form, Elizabeth's husband, is aware of his wife's professional fame, has heard of the large sums of money which she earns as the greatest living professor of massage, has been long on the lookout for her, and has discovered her at last. He has not only forced his way into her sitting-room at the hotel, he insists on her living with him again, her money being the attraction, it is needless to say. If she refuses, he threatens her with the law, the barbarous law, which, to use his own coarse expression, will restore his conjugal rights. All this I gather from the narrative of my unhappy friend, which forms one of the 2 enclosures in her parcel. She has already made her escape. Ha! The man doesn't live who can circumvent Elizabeth. The English court of law isn't built which can catch her when she roams the free and glorious continent. The vastness of this amazing woman's mind is what I must pause to admire. In the frightful catastrophe that has befallen her, she can still think of Philip and Eunice. She is eager to hear of their marriage, and renounces Helena with her whole heart. I, too, was deceived by that cunning young woman, she writes. Beware of her, Selina. Unless I am much mistaken, she is going to end badly. Take care of Philip. Take care of Eunice. If you want help, apply at once to my favorite hero in real life, the Governor. I don't presume to correct Elizabeth's language. I should have called you the idol of the women. The second enclosure contains, as I suppose, a wedding present. It is carefully sealed. It feels no bigger than an ordinary letter, and it contains an inscription which your highly cultivated intelligence may be able to explain. I copy it as follows: To be enclosed in another envelope, addressed to Mr. Dunboyne the elder, at Percy's Private Hotel, London, and delivered by a trustworthy messenger, on the day when Mr. Philip Dunboyne is married to Miss Eunice Gracedieu, placed meanwhile under the care of Miss Selina Jillgall. Why is this mysterious letter to be sent to Philip's father? I wonder whether that circumstance will puzzle you as it has puzzled me. I have kept my report back, so as to send you the last news relating to Philip's state of health. To my great regret, his illness seems to have made a serious advance since yesterday. When I ask if he is in pain, he says, "It isn't exactly pain. I feel as if I was sinking. Sometimes I am giddy, and sometimes I find myself feeling thirsty and sick. I have no opportunity of looking after him as I could wish, for Helena insists on nursing him, assisted by the housemaid. Maria is a very good girl in her way, but too stupid to be of much use. If he is not better tomorrow, I shall insist on sending for the doctor. He is no better, and he wishes to have medical help. Helena doesn't seem to understand his illness. It was not until Philip had insisted on seeing him that she consented to send for the doctor. You had some talk with this experienced physician when you were here, and you know what a clever man he is. When I tell you that he hesitates to say what is the matter with Philip, you will feel as much alarmed as I do. I will wait to send this to the post until I can write in a more definite way. 2 more days have passed. The doctor has put 2 very strange questions to me. He asked, first, if there was anybody staying with us besides the regular members of the household. I said we had no visitor. He wanted to know next if Mr. Philip Dunboyne had made any enemies since he has been living in our town. I said none that I knew of, and I took the liberty of asking what he meant. He answered to this that he has a few more inquiries to make, and that he will tell me what he means tomorrow. For God's sake, come here as soon as you possibly can. The whole burden is thrown on me, and I am quite unequal to it. I received the doctor to-day in the drawing-room. To my amazement, he begged leave to speak with me in the garden. When I asked why, he answered, "I don't want to have a listener at the door. Come out on the lawn, where we can be sure that we are alone." When we were in the garden, he noticed that I was trembling. "Rouse your courage, Miss Jillgall," he said. "In the minister's helpless state, there is nobody whom I can speak to but yourself." I ventured to remind him that he might speak to Helena as well as to myself. He looked as black as thunder when I mentioned her name. All he said was, "No." But oh, if you had heard his voice! And he so gentle and sweet-tempered at other times, you would have felt as I did, that he had Helena in his mind. "Now listen to this," he went on. "Everything that my art can do for Mr. Philip Dunboyne, while I am at his bedside, is undone while I am away by some other person. He is worse to-day than I have seen him yet." "Oh, sir, do you think he will die?" "He will certainly die, unless the right means are taken to save him, and taken at once. It is my duty not to flinch from telling you the truth. I have made a discovery since yesterday which satisfies me that I am right. Somebody is trying to poison Mr. Dunboyne, and somebody will succeed unless he is removed from this house. I am a poor feeble creature. The doctor caught me, or I should have dropped on the grass. It was not a fainting fit. I only shook and shivered so that I was too weak to stand up. Encouraged by the doctor, I recovered sufficiently to be able to ask him where Philip was to be taken to. He said, "To the hospital. No poisoner can follow my patient there. Persuade him to let me take him away, when I call again in an hour's time." As soon as I could hold a pen, I sent a telegram to you. Pray, pray come by the earliest train. I also telegraphed to old Mr. Dunboyne, at the hotel in London. It was impossible for me to face Helena. I own I was afraid. The cook kindly went upstairs to see who was in Philip's room. It was the housemaid's turn to look after him for a while. I went instantly to his bedside. There was no persuading him to allow himself to be taken to the hospital. "I am dying," he said. "If you have any pity for me, send for Eunice. Let me see her once more. Let me hear her say that she forgives me before I die." I hesitated. It was too terrible to think of Eunice in the same house with her sister. Her life might be in danger. Philip gave me a look, a dreadful, ghastly look. "If you refuse," he said wildly, "the grave won't hold me. I'll haunt you for the rest of your life." "She shall hear that you are ill," I answered, and ran out of the house before he could speak again. What I had promised to write, I did write. But, placed between Eunice's danger and Philip's danger, my heart was all for Eunice. Would Helena spare her, if she came to Philip's bedside? In such terror as I never felt before in my life, I added a word more, entreating her not to leave the farm. I promised to keep her regularly informed on the subject of Philip's illness, and I mentioned that I expected the Governor to return to us immediately. "Do nothing," I wrote, "without his advice." My letter having been completed, I sent the cook away with it in a chaise. She belonged to the neighborhood, and she knew the farmhouse well. Nearly 2 hours afterward, I heard the chaise stop at the door, and ran out, impatient to hear how my sweet girl had received my letter. God help Chapter 59 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 59. Defense. One surprise followed another, after I had encountered Eunice at the door. When my fondness had excused her for setting the well-meant advice in my letter at defiance, I was conscious of expecting to see her in tears, eager, distressingly eager, to hear what hope there might be of Philip's recovery. I saw no tears, I heard no inquiries. She was pale, and quiet, and silent. Not a word fell from her when we met, not a word when she kissed me. Not a word when she led the way into the nearest room, the dining room. It was only when we were shut in together that she spoke. "Which is Philip's room?" she asked. Instead of wanting to know how he was, she desired to know where he was. I pointed toward the back dining room, which had been made into a bedroom for Philip. He had chosen it himself, when he first came to stay with us, because the window opened into the garden, and he could slip out and smoke at any hour of the day or night, when he pleased. "Who is with him now?" was the next strange thing this sadly changed girl said to me. "Maria is taking her turn," I answered. "She assists in nursing Philip." "Where is—" Eunice got no further than that. Her breath quickened, her color faded away. I had seen people look as she was looking now, when they suffered under some sudden pain. Before I could offer to help her, she rallied, and went on. "Where," she began again, "is the other nurse?" "You mean Helena," I said. "I mean the poisoner. When I remind you, dear Mr. Governor, that my letter had carefully concealed from her the horrible discovery made by the doctor, your imagination will picture my state of mind. She saw that I was overpowered. Her sweet nature, so strangely frozen up thus far, melted at last. 'You don't know what I have heard,' she said. 'You don't know what thoughts have been roused in me.' She left her chair, and sat on my knee with the familiarity of the dear old times, and took the letter that I had written to her from her pocket. 'Look at it yourself,' she said, 'and tell me if anybody could read it, and not see that you were concealing something. My dear, I have driven round by the doctor's house. I have seen him. I have persuaded him, or perhaps I ought to say surprised him, into telling me the truth. But the kind old man is obstinate. He wouldn't believe me when I told him I was on my way here to save Philip's life. He said, 'My child, you will only put your own life in jeopardy.' If I had not seen that danger, I should never have told you of the dreadful state of things at home. Go back to the good people at the farm, and leave the saving of Philip to me." "He was right, Eunice, entirely right." "No, dear, he was wrong. I begged him to come here and judge for himself, and I ask you to do the same." I was obstinate. "Go back," I persisted. "Go back to the farm." "Can I see Philip?" she asked. I have heard some insolent men say that women are like cats. If they mean that we do, figuratively speaking, scratch at times, I am afraid they are not altogether wrong. An irresistible impulse made me say to poor Eunice, "This is a change indeed, since you refuse to receive Philip." "Is there no change in the circumstances?" she asked sadly. "Isn't he ill and in danger?" I begged her to forgive me. I said I meant no harm. "I gave him up to my sister," she continued, "when I believed that his happiness depended, not on me, but on her. I take him back to myself, when he is at the mercy of a demon who threatens his life. Come, Selina, let us go to Philip." She put her arm round me, and made me get up from my chair. I was so easily persuaded by her that the fear of what Helena's jealousy and Helena's anger might do was scarcely present in my thoughts. The door of communication was locked on the side of the bedchamber. I went into the hall, to enter Philip's room by the other door. She followed, waiting behind me. I heard what passed between them when Maria went out to her. "Where is Miss Gracedieu?" "Resting upstairs, miss, in her room." "Look at the clock, and tell me when you expect her to come down here." "I am to call her, miss, in 10 minutes more." "Wait in the dining room, Maria, till I come back to you." She joined me. I held the door open for her to go into Philip's room. It was not out of curiosity; the feeling that urged me was sympathy, when I waited a moment to see their first meeting. She bent over the poor, pallid, trembling, suffering man, and raised him in her arms, and laid his head on her bosom. "My Philip!" She murmured those words in a kiss. I closed the door, I had a good cry, and oh, how it comforted me! There was only a minute to spare when she came out of the room. Maria was waiting for her. Eunice said, as quietly as ever, "Go and call Miss Gracedieu." The girl looked at her and saw, I don't know what. Maria became alarmed. But she went up the stairs, and returned in haste to tell us that her young mistress was coming down. The faint rustling of Helena's dress as she left her room reached us in the silence. I remained at the open door of the dining room, and Maria approached and stood near me. We were both frightened. Eunice stepped forward, and stood on the mat at the foot of the stairs, waiting. Her back was toward me. I could only see that she was as still as a statue. The rustling of the dress came nearer. Oh, heavens! What was going to happen? My teeth chattered in my head. I held by Maria's shoulder. Drops of perspiration showed themselves on the girl's forehead. She stared in vacant terror at the slim little figure, posted firm and still on the mat. Helena turned the corner of the stairs, and waited a moment on the last landing, and saw her sister. "You here," she said. "What do you want?" There was no reply. Helena descended until she reached the last stair but one. There she stopped. Her staring eyes grew large and wild. Her hand shook as she stretched it out, feeling for the banister. She staggered as she caught at it, and held herself up. The silence was still unbroken. Something in me, stronger than myself, drew my steps along the hall nearer and nearer to the stair, till I could see the face which had struck that murderous wretch with terror. I looked. No, it was not my sweet girl. It was a horrid transformation of her. I saw a fearful creature, with glittering eyes that threatened some unimaginable vengeance. Her lips were drawn back; they showed her clenched teeth. A burning red flush dyed her face. The hair of her head rose, little by little, slowly; and, most dreadful sight of all, she seemed in the stillness of the house to be listening to something. If I could have moved, I should have fled to the first place of refuge I could find. If I could have raised my voice, I should have cried for help. I could do neither the one nor the other. I could only look, held by the horror of it with a hand of iron. Helena must have roused her courage, and resisted her terror. I heard her speak. "Let me by." No. Slowly, steadily, in a whisper, Eunice made that reply. Helena tried once more, still fighting against her own terror. I knew it by the trembling of her voice. "Let me by," she repeated. "I am on my way to Philip's room." "You will never enter Philip's room again." "Who will stop me?" "I will." She had spoken in the same steady whisper throughout, but now she moved. I saw her set her foot on the first stair. I saw the horrid glitter in her eyes flash close into Helena's face. I heard her say, "Poisoner, go back to your room." Silent and shuddering, Helena shrank away from her, daunted by her glittering eyes, mastered by her lifted hand pointing up the stairs. Helena slowly ascended till she reached the landing. She turned and looked down. She tried to speak. The pointing hand struck her dumb, and drove her up the next flight of stairs. She was lost to view. Only the small rustling sound of the dress was to be heard, growing fainter and fainter; then an interval of stillness; then the noise of a door opened and closed again; then no sound more. But a change to be seen. The transformed creature was crouching on her knees, still and silent, her face covered by her hands. I was afraid to approach her. I was afraid to speak to her. After a time she rose. Suddenly, swiftly, With her head turned away from me, she opened the door of Philip's room, and was gone. I looked round. There was only Maria in the lonely hall. Shall I try to tell you what my sensations were? It may sound strangely, but it is true.
Chapter 60 of the Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 60 Discovery. A little later on that eventful day, when I was most in need of all that your wisdom and kindness could do to guide me, came the telegram which announced that you were helpless under an attack of gout. As soon as I had in some degree got over my disappointment, I remembered having told Eunice in my letter that I expected her kind old friend to come to us. With the telegram in my hand, I knocked softly at Philip's door. The voice that bade me come in was the gentle voice I knew so well. Philip was sleeping. There, by his bedside, with his hand resting in her hand, was Eunice, so completely restored to her own sweet self that I could hardly believe what I had seen not an hour since. She talked of you, when I showed her your message, with affectionate interest and regret. Look back, my admirable friend, at what I have written on the 2 or 3 pages which precede this, and explain the astounding contrast if you can. I was left alone to watch by Philip, while Eunice went away to see her father. Soon afterwards, Maria took my place. I had been sent for to the next room to receive the doctor. He looked careworn and grieved. I said I was afraid that he brought bad news with him. "The worst possible news," he answered. "A terrible exposure threatens this family, and I am powerless to prevent it." He then asked me to remember the day when I had been surprised by the singular questions which he had put to me, and when he had engaged to explain himself after he had made some inquiries. Why and how he had set those inquiries on foot was what he had now to tell. I will repeat what he said in his own words as nearly as I can remember them. While he was in attendance on Philip, he had observed symptoms which made him suspect that digitalis had been given to the young man, in doses often repeated. Cases of attempted poisoning by this medicine were so rare that he felt bound to put his suspicions to the test by going round among the chemists' shops, excepting, of course, the shop at which his own prescriptions were made up, and asking if they had lately dispensed any preparation of digitalis, ordered perhaps in a larger quantity than usual. At the second shop he visited, the chemist laughed. "Why, doctor," he said, "have you forgotten your own prescription?" After this, the prescription was asked for and produced. It was on the paper used by the doctor, paper which had his address printed at the top, and a notice added, telling patients who came to consult him for the second time to bring their prescriptions with them. Then there followed in writing, "Tincture of digitalis, 1 ounce," with his signature at the end, not badly imitated, but a forgery nevertheless. The chemist noticed the effect which this discovery had produced on the doctor, and asked if that was his signature. He could hardly, as an honest man, have asserted that a forgery was a signature of his own writing, so he made the true reply, and asked who had presented the prescription. The chemist asked his assistant to come forward. "Did you tell me that you knew, by sight, the young lady who brought this prescription?" The assistant admitted it. "Did you tell me she was Miss Helen Gracedieu?" "I did." "Were you sure of not having made any mistake?" "Quite sure." The chemist then said, "I myself supplied the tincture of digitalis, and the young lady paid for it and took it away with her. You have had all the information that I can give you, sir, and may I now ask if you can throw any light on the matter?" Our good friend thought of the poor minister, so sorely afflicted, and of the famous name so sincerely respected in the town and on the country round, and said he could not undertake to give an immediate answer. The chemist was excessively angry. "You know as well as I do," he said, "that digitalis, given in certain doses, is a poison, and you cannot deny that I honestly believed myself to be dispensing your prescription. While you are hesitating to give me an answer, my character may suffer. I may be suspected myself." He ended in declaring he should consult his lawyer. The doctor went home and questioned his servant. The man remembered the day of Miss Helena's visit in the afternoon, and the intention that she expressed of waiting for his master's return. He had shown her into the parlor which opened into the consulting room. No other visitor was in the house at that time, or had arrived during the rest of the day. The doctor's own experience, when he got home, led him to conclude that Helena had gone into the consulting room. He had entered that room for the purpose of writing some prescriptions, and had found the leaves of paper which he used diminished in number. After what he had heard, and what he had discovered, to say nothing of what he suspected, it occurred to him to look along the shelves of his medical library. He found a volume, treating of poisons, with a slip of paper left between the leaves, the poison described at the place so marked being digitalis, and the paper used being one of his own prescription papers. If, as I fear, a legal investigation into Helena's conduct is a possible event, the doctor concluded, there is the evidence that I shall be obliged to give when I am called as witness. It is my belief that I could have felt no greater dismay if the long arm of the law had laid its hold on me while he was speaking. I asked what was to be done. "If she leaves the house at once," the doctor replied, "she may escape the infamy of being charged with an attempt at murder by poison, and in her absence I can answer for Philip's life. I don't urge you to warn her, because that might be a dangerous thing to do. It is for you to decide, as a member of the family, whether you will run the risk." I tried to speak to him of Eunice, and to tell him what I had already related to yourself. He was in no humor to listen to me. "Keep it for a fitter time," he answered, "and think of what I have just said to you." With that he left me on his way to Philip's room. Mental exertion was completely beyond me. Can you understand a poor middle-aged spinster being frightened into doing a dangerous thing? That may seem to be nonsense. But if you ask why I took a morsel of paper and wrote the warning which I was afraid to communicate by word of mouth, why I went upstairs with my knees knocking together and opened the door of Helena's room just wide enough to let my hand pass through, why I threw the paper in and banged the door to again, and ran downstairs as I have never run since I was a little girl, I can only say, in the way of explanation, what I have said already. I was frightened into doing it. What I have written, thus far, I shall send to you by tonight's post. The doctor came back to me after he had seen Philip, and spoke with Eunice. He was very angry, and, I must own, not without reason. Philip had flatly refused to let himself be removed to the hospital, and Eunice, a mere girl, had declared that she would be answerable for consequences. The doctor warned me that he meant to withdraw from the case, and to make his declaration before the magistrates. At my entreaties he consented to return in the evening, and to judge by results before making the terrible step that he had threatened. While I remained at home on the watch, keeping the doors of both rooms locked, Eunice went out to get Philip's medicine. She came back, followed by a boy carrying a portable apparatus for cooking. "All that Philip wants, and all that we want," she explained, "we can provide for ourselves. Give me a morsel of paper to write on." Unhooking the little pencil attached to her watch-chain, she paused and looked toward the door. "Somebody listening," she whispered. "Let them listen." She wrote a list of necessaries, in the way of things to eat and things to drink, and asked me to go out and get them myself. "I don't doubt the servants," she said, speaking distinctly enough to be heard outside, "but I am afraid of what a poisoner's cunning and a poisoner's desperation may do in a kitchen which is open to her." I went away on my errand, discovering no listener outside, I need hardly say. On my return, I found the door of communication with Philip's room closed, but no longer locked. "We can now attend on him in turn," she said, "without opening either of the doors which lead into the hall. At night we can relieve each other, and each of us can get sleep as we want it in the large armchair in the dining-room. Philip must be safe under our charge, or the doctor will insist on taking him to the hospital. When we want Maria's help from time to time, we can employ her under our own superintendence. Have you anything else, Selina, to suggest?" There was nothing left to suggest. Young and inexperienced as she was, how, I asked, had she contrived to think of all this? She answered simply, "I'm sure I don't know. My thoughts came to me while I was looking at Philip." Soon afterwards I found an opportunity of inquiring if Helena had left the house. She had just rung her bell, and Maria had found her quietly reading in her room. Hours afterward, when I was on the watch at night, I heard Philip's door softly tried from the outside. Her dreadful purpose had not been given up even yet. The doctor came in the evening as he had promised, and found an improvement in Philip's health. I mentioned what precautions we had taken, and that they had been devised by Eunice. "Are you going to withdraw from the case?" I asked. "I am coming back to the case," he answered, "to-morrow morning." It had been a disappointment to me to receive no answer to the telegram which I had sent to Mr. Dunboyne the elder. The next day's post brought the explanation, in a letter to Philip from his father, directed to him at the hotel here. This showed that my telegram, giving my address at this house, had not been received. Mr. Dunboyne announced that he had returned to Ireland, finding the air of London unendurable after the sea breezes at home. If Philip had already married, his father would leave him to a life of genteel poverty with Helena Gracedieu. If he had thought better of it, his welcome was waiting for him. Little did Mr. Dunboyne know what changes had taken place since he and his son had last met, and what hope might yet present itself of brighter days for poor Eunice. I thought of writing to him, but how would that crabbed old man receive a confidential letter from a lady who was a stranger? My doubts were set at rest by Philip himself. He asked me to write a few lines of reply to his father, declaring that his marriage with Helena was broken off, that he had not given up all hope of being permitted to offer the sincere expression of his penitence to Eunice, and that he would gladly claim his welcome as soon as he was well enough to undertake the journey to Ireland. When he had signed the letter, I was so pleased that I made a smart remark. I said, "This is a treaty of peace between father and son." When the doctor arrived in the morning, and found the change for the better in his patient confirmed, he did justice to us at last. He spoke kindly, even gratefully, to Eunice. No more allusions to the hospital as a place of safety escaped him. He asked me cautiously for news of Helena. I could only tell him that she had gone out at her customary time, and had returned at her customary time. He did not attempt to conceal that my reply had made him uneasy. "Are you still afraid that she may succeed in poisoning Philip?" I asked. "I am afraid of her cunning," he said. "If she is charged with attempting to poison young Dunboyne, she has some system of defence, you may rely on it, for which we are not prepared. There, in my opinion, is the true reason for her extraordinary insensibility to her own danger." 2 more days passed, and we were still safe under the protection of lock and key. On the evening of the second day, which was a Monday, Maria came to me in great tribulation. On inquiring what was the matter, I received a disquieting reply. "Miss Helena is tempting me. She is so miserable at being prevented from seeing Mr. Philip and helping to nurse him that it is quite distressing to see her. At the same time, miss, it's hard on a poor servant. She asked me to take the key secretly out of the door and lend it to her at night for a few minutes only. I'm really afraid I shall be led into doing it if she goes on persuading me much longer." I commended Maria for feeling scruples which proved her to be the best of good girls, and promised to relieve her from all fear of future temptation. This was easily done. Eunice kept the key of
Chapter 61 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 61. Atrocity. On the next day, a Tuesday in the week, an event took place which Eunice and I viewed with distrust. Early in the afternoon, a young man called with a note for Helena. It was to be given to her immediately, and no answer was required. Maria had just closed the house door, and was on her way upstairs with the letter, when she was called back by another ring at the bell. Our visitor was the doctor. He spoke to Maria in the hall. "I think I see a note in your hand. Was it given to you by the young man who has just left the house?" "Yes, sir." "If he's your sweetheart, my dear, I have nothing more to say." "Good gracious, doctor, how you do talk. I never saw the young man before in my life." "In that case, Maria, I will ask you to let me look at the address. Aha! Mischief." The moment I heard that, I threw open the dining-room door. Curiosity is not easily satisfied. When it hears, it wants to see. When it sees, it wants to know. Every lady will agree with me in this observation. "Pray come in," I said. "1 minute, Miss Jilgle. My girl, when you give Miss Helena that note, try to get a sly look at her when she opens it, and come and tell me what you have seen." He joined me in the dining-room and closed the door. "The other day," he went on, "when I told you what I had discovered in the chemist's shop, I think I mentioned a young man who was called to speak to a question of identity. An assistant who knew Miss Helena greeted you by sight." "Yes, yes. That young man left the note which Maria has just taken upstairs." "Who wrote it, doctor, and what does it say?" "Questions naturally asked, Miss Jilgle, and not easily answered. Where is Eunice? Her quick wit might help us." She had gone out to buy some fruit and flowers for Philip. The doctor accepted his disappointment resignedly. "Let us try what we can do without her," he said. "That young man's master has been in consultation, you may remember why, with his lawyer, and Helena may be threatened by an investigation before the magistrates. If this wild guess of mine turns out to have hit the mark, the poisoner upstairs has got a warning." I asked if the chemist had written the note. Foolish enough of me when I came to think of it. The chemist would scarcely act a friendly part towards Helena when she was answerable for the awkward position in which he had placed himself. Perhaps the young man who had left the warning was also the writer of the warning. The doctor reminded me that he was all but a stranger to Helena. "We are not usually interested," he remarked, "in a person whom we only know by sight." "Remember that he is a young man," I ventured to say. This was a strong hint, but the doctor failed to see it. He had evidently forgotten his own youth. I made another attempt. "And vile as Helena is," I continued, "we cannot deny that this disgrace to her sex is a handsome young lady." He saw it at last. "Woman's wit," he cried. "You have hit it, Miss Jilgle. The young fool is smitten with her, and has given her a chance of making her escape. Do you think she will take the chance?" "For all our sakes, I pray God she may. But I don't feel sure about it." "Why?" "Recollect what you and Eunice have done. You have shown your suspicion of her without an attempt to conceal it. If you had put her in prison, you could not have more completely defeated her infernal design. Do you think she is a likely person to submit to that without an effort to be even with you?" Just as he said those terrifying words, Maria came back to us. He asked at once what had kept her so long upstairs. The girl had evidently something to say, which had inflated her, if I may use such an expression, with a sense of her own importance. "Please to let me tell it, sir," she answered, "in my own way. Miss Helena turned as pale as ashes when she opened the letter, and then she took a turn in the room, and then she looked at me with a smile. Well, miss, I can only say that I felt that smile in the small of my back. I tried to get to the door. She stopped me. She says, "Where's Miss Eunice?" I says, "Gone out." She says, "Is there anybody in the drawing room?" I says, "No, miss." She says, "Tell Miss Jilgall I want to speak to her, and say I am waiting in the drawing room." It's every word of it true. And if a poor servant may give an opinion, I don't like the look of it. The doctor dismissed Maria. "Whatever it is," he said to me, "you must go and hear it." I am not a courageous woman. I expressed myself as being willing to go to her if the doctor went with me. He said that was impossible. She would probably refuse to speak before any witness, and certainly before him. But he promised to look after Philip in my absence, and to wait below if it really so happened that I wanted him. I need only ring the bell, and he would come to me the moment he heard it. Such kindness as this roused my courage, I suppose. At any rate, I went upstairs. She was standing by the fireplace, with her elbow on the chimney-piece and her head resting on her hand. I stopped just inside the door, waiting to hear what she had to say. In this position, her side face only was presented to me. It was a ghastly face. The eye that I could see turned wickedly on me when I came in, then turned away again. Otherwise, she never moved. I confess I trembled, but I did my best to disguise it. She broke out suddenly with what she had to say. I won't allow this state of things to go on any longer. My horror of an exposure which will disgrace the family has kept me silent, wrongly silent, so far. Philip's life is in danger. I am forgetting my duty to my affianced husband if I allow myself to be kept away from him any longer. Open those locked doors, and relieve me from the sight of you. Open the doors, I say, or you will both of you, you the accomplice, she the wretch who directs you, repent it to the end of your lives. In my own mind, I asked myself if she had gone mad. But I only answered, "I don't understand you." She said again, "You are Eunice's accomplice." "Accomplice in what?" I asked. She turned her head slowly and faced me. I shrank from looking at her. "All the circumstances prove it," she went on. "I have supplanted Eunice in Philip's affection. She was once engaged to marry him. I am engaged to marry him now. She is resolved that he shall never make me his wife. He will die if I delay any longer. He will die if I don't crush her. Like the reptile she is, she comes here, and what does she do? Keeps him prisoner under her own superintendence. Who gets his medicine? She gets it. Who cooks his food? She cooks it. The doors are locked. I might be a witness of what goes on, and I am kept out. The servants who ought to wait on him are kept out. She can do what she likes with his medicine. She can do what she likes with his food. She is infuriated with him for deserting her and promising to marry me. Give him back to my care, or dreadful as it is to denounce my own sister, I shall claim protection from the magistrates. I lost all fear of her. I stepped close up to the place at which she was standing. I cried out, "Of what, in God's name, do you accuse your sister?" She answered, "I accuse her of poisoning Philip Dunboyne." I ran out of the room. I rushed headlong down the stairs. The doctor heard me, and came running into the hall. I caught hold of him like a madwoman. "Eunice!" My breath was gone. I could only say, "Eunice!" He dragged me into the dining room. There was wine on the sideboard, which he had ordered medically for Philip. He forced me to drink some of it. It ran through me like fire. It helped me to speak. "Now tell me," he said, "what has she done to Eunice?" "She brings a horrible accusation against her," I answered. "What is the accusation?" I told him. He looked me through and through. "Take care," he said. "No hysterics, no exaggeration. You may lead to dreadful consequences if you are not sure of yourself. If it's really true, say it again." I said it again, quietly this time. His face startled me. It was white with rage. He snatched his hat off the hall table. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "My duty." He was out of the house before I could speak to him again. Third period concluded.
Chapter 62 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilkie Mills. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 62. The Sentence Pronounced. Martyrs to gout know, by sad experience, that they suffer under one of the most capricious of maladies. An attack of this disease will shift, in the most unaccountable manner, from one part of the body to another, or it will release the victim when there is every reason to fear that it is about to strengthen its hold on him, or, having shown the fairest promise of submitting to medical treatment, it will cruelly lay the patient prostrate again in a state of relapse. Adverse fortune, in my case, subjected me to this last and worst trial of endurance. 2 months passed, months of pain aggravated by anxiety, before I was able to help Eunice and Miss Jillgall personally with my sympathy and advice. During this interval, I heard regularly from the friendly and faithful Helena. Terror and suspense, courageously endured day after day, seemed to have broken down her resistance, poor soul, when Eunice's good name and Eunice's tranquillity were threatened by the most infamous of false accusations. From that time, Miss Jillgall's method of expressing herself betrayed a gradual deterioration. I shall avoid presenting at a disadvantage a correspondent who has claims on my gratitude, if I give the substance only of what she wrote, assisted by the newspaper which she sent to me while the legal proceedings were in progress. Honest indignation does sometimes counsel us wisely. When the doctor left Miss Jillgall in anger and in haste, he had determined on taking the course from which, as a humane man and a faithful friend, he had hitherto recoiled. It was no time now to shrink from the prospect of an exposure. The one hope of successfully encountering the vindictive wickedness of Helena lay in the resolution to be beforehand with her, in the appeal to the magistrates with which she had threatened Eunice and Miss Jillgall. The doctor's sworn information stated the whole terrible case of the poisoning, ranging from his first suspicions and their confirmation to Helena's atrocious attempt to accuse her innocent sister of her own guilt. So firmly were the magistrates convinced of the serious nature of the case thus stated, that they did not hesitate to issue their warrant. Among the witnesses whose attendance was immediately secured by the legal adviser to whom the doctor applied were the farmer and his wife. Helena was arrested while she was dressing to go out. Her composure was not for a moment disturbed. "I was on my way," she said coolly, "to make a statement before the justices. The sooner they hear what I have to say, the better." The attempt of this shameless wretch to turn the tables on poor Eunice suggested, as I afterward discovered, by the record of the family history which she had quoted in her journal, was defeated with ease. The farmer and his wife proved the date at which Eunice had left her place of residence under their roof. The doctor's evidence followed. He proved by the production of his professional diary that the discovery of the attempt to poison his patient had taken place before the day of Eunice's departure from the farm, and that the first improvement in Mr. Philip Dunboyne's state of health had shown itself after that young lady's arrival to perform the duties of a nurse. To the wise precautions which she had taken, perverted by Helena to the purpose of a false accusation, the doctor attributed the preservation of the young man's life. Having produced the worst possible impression on the minds of the magistrates, Helena was remanded. Her legal adviser had predicted this result, but the vindictive obstinacy of his client had set both experience and remonstrance at defiance. At the renewed examination, the line of defense adopted by the prisoner's lawyer proved to be mistaken identity. It was asserted that she had never entered the chemist's shop, also that the assistant had wrongly identified some other lady as Miss Helena Gracedieu, also that there was not an atom of evidence to connect her with the stealing of the doctor's prescription paper and the forgery of his writing. Other assertions to the same purpose followed, on which it is needless to dwell. The case for the prosecution was, happily, in competent hands. With the exception of one witness, cross-examination afforded no material help to the evidence for the defense. The chemist swore positively to the personal appearance of Helena, as being the personal appearance of the lady who had presented the prescription. His assistant, pressed under the question of identity, broke down under cross-examination, purposely, as it was whispered, serving the interests of the prisoner. But the victory, so far gained by the defense, was successfully contested by the statement of the next witness, a respectable tradesman in the town. He had seen the newspaper report of the first examination, and had volunteered to present himself as a witness. A member of Mr. Gracedieu's congregation, his pew in the chapel was so situated as to give him a view of the minister's daughters occupying their pew. He had seen the prisoner on every Sunday for years past, and he swore that he was passing the door of the chemist's shop at the moment when she stepped out into the street, having a bottle covered with the customary white paper in her hand. The doctor and his servant were the next witnesses called. They were severely cross-examined. Some of their statements, questioned technically with success, received unexpected and powerful support, due to the discovery and production of the prisoner's diary. The entries, guardedly as some of them were written, revealed her motive for attempting to poison Philip Dunboyne, proved that she had purposely called on the doctor when she knew that he would be out, that she had entered the consulting room and examined the medical books, had found, to use her own written words, a volume that interested her, and had used the prescription papers for the purpose of making notes. The notes themselves were not to be found. They had doubtless been destroyed. Enough, and more than enough, remained to make the case for the prosecution complete. The magistrates committed Helena Gracedieu for trial at the next assizes. I arrived in the town, as well as I can remember, about a week after the trial had taken place. Found guilty, the prisoner had been recommended to mercy by the jury, partly in consideration of her youth, partly as an expression of sympathy and respect for her unhappy father. The judge, a father himself, passed a lenient sentence. She was condemned to imprisonment for 2 years. The careful matron of the jail had provided herself with a bottle of smelling salts, in the fear that there might be need for it when Helena heard her sentence pronounced. Not the slightest sign of agitation appeared in her face or her manner. She lied to the last, asserting her innocence in a firm voice, and returning from the dock to the prison without requiring assistance from anybody. Relating these particulars to me in a state of ungovernable excitement, good Miss Jillgall ended with a little confession of her own, which operated as a relief to my overburdened mind after what I had just heard. "I wouldn't own it," she said, "to anybody but a dear friend. One thing, in the dreadful disgrace that has fallen on us, I am quite at a loss to account for. Think of Mr. Gracedieu's daughter being one of those criminal creatures on whom it was once your terrible duty to turn the key. Why didn't she commit suicide?" "My dear lady, no thoroughly wicked creature ever yet committed suicide. Self-destruction, when it is not an act of madness, implies some acuteness of feeling, sensibility to remorse or to shame, or perhaps a distorted idea of making atonement. There is no such thing as remorse or shame or hope of making atonement in Helena's nature." "But when she comes out of prison, what will she do?" "Don't alarm yourself, my good friend. She will do very well." "Oh, hush, hush! Poetical justice, Mr. Governor." Chapter 63 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilkie Mills. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 63. The Obstacle Removed. When the subject of the trial was happily dismissed, my first inquiry related to Eunice. The reply was made with an ominous accompaniment of sighs and sad looks. Eunice had gone back to her duties as governess at the farm. Hearing this, I asked, naturally, what had become of Philip. Melancholy news again was the news that I now heard. Mr. Dunboyne, the elder, had died suddenly at his house in Ireland, while Philip was on his way home. When the funeral ceremony had come to an end, the will was read. It had been made only a few days before the testator's death, and the clause which left all his property to his son was preceded by expressions of paternal affection, at a time when Philip was in sore need of consolation. After alluding to a letter received from his son, the old man added, "I always loved him without caring to confess it. I detest scenes of sentiment, kissings, embracings, tears, and that sort of thing. But Philip has yielded to my wishes, and has broken off a marriage which would have made him, as well as me, wretched for life. After this I may speak my mind from my grave, and may tell my boy that I loved him. If the wish is likely to be of any use, I will add, on the chance, God bless him." "Does Philip submit to separation from Eunice?" I asked. "Does he stay in Ireland?" "Not he, poor fellow. He will be here tomorrow or next day. When I last wrote," Miss Jillgall continued, "I told him I hoped to see you again soon. If you can't help us, I mean with Eunice, that unlucky young man will do some desperate thing. He will join those madmen at large who disturb poor savages in Africa, or go nowhere to find nothing in the Arctic regions." "Whatever I can do, Miss Jillgall, shall be gladly done. Is it really possible that Eunice refuses to marry him after having saved his life?" "A little patience, please, Mr. Governor. Let Philip tell his own story. If I try to do it, I shall only cry, and we have had tears enough lately in this house." Further consultation being thus deferred, I went upstairs to the minister's room. He was sitting by the window in his favourite armchair, absorbed in knitting. The person who attended on him, a good-natured, patient fellow, had been a sailor in his younger days, and had taught Mr. Gracedieu how to use the needles. "You see, it amuses him," the man said kindly. "Don't notice his mistakes. He thinks there isn't such another in the world for knitting as himself. You can see, sir, how he sticks to it." He was so absorbed over his employment that I had to speak to him twice before I could induce him to look at me. The utter ruin of his intellect did not appear to have exercised any disastrous influence over his bodily health. On the contrary, he had grown fatter since I had last seen him. His complexion had lost the pallor that I remembered. There was colour in his cheeks. "Don't you remember your old friend?" I said. He smiled and nodded and repeated the words. Yes, my old friend." It was only too plain that he had not the least recognition of me. "His memory is gone," the man said. "When he puts away his knitting at night, I have to find it for him in the morning. But there, he's happy, enjoys his victuals, likes sitting out in the garden and watching the birds. There's been a deal of trouble in the family, sir, and it has all passed over him like a wet sponge over a slate." The old sailor was right. If that wreck of a man had been capable of feeding and thinking, his daughter's disgrace would have broken his heart. In a world of sin and sorrow, is peaceable imbecility always to be pitied? I have known men who would have answered without hesitation, "It is to be envied." And where, some persons might say, was the poor minister's reward for the act of mercy which had saved Eunice in her infancy? Where it ought to be. A man who worthily performs a good action finds his reward in the action itself. At breakfast on the next day, the talk touched on those passages in Helena's diary which had been produced in court as evidence against her. I expressed a wish to see what revelation of a depraved nature the entries in the diary might present, and my curiosity was gratified. At a fitter time I may find an opportunity of alluding to the impression produced on me by the diary. In the meanwhile, the event of Philip's return claims notice in the first place. The poor fellow was so glad to see me that he shook hands as heartily as if we had known each other from the time when he was a boy. "Do you remember how kindly you spoke to me when I called on you in London?" he asked. "If I have repeated those words once, but perhaps you don't remember them, you said, 'If I was as young as you are, I should not despair.' Well, I have said that to myself over and over again, for 100 times at least. Eunice will listen to you, sir, when she will listen to nobody else. This is the first happy moment I have had for weeks past." I suppose I must have looked glad to hear that. Anyway, Philip shook hands with me again. Miss Jillgall was present. The genial-hearted old maid was so touched by our meeting that she abandoned herself to the genial impulse of the moment, and gave Philip a kiss. The outraged claims of propriety instantly seized on her. She blushed as if the long-lost days of her girlhood had been found again, and ran out of the room. "Now, Mr. Philip," I said, "I have been waiting at Miss Jillgall's suggestion to get my information from you. There is something wrong between Eunice and yourself. What is it? And who is to blame?" "Her vile sister is to blame," he answered. "That reptile was determined to sting us, and she has done it," he cried, starting to his feet and walking up and down the room, urged into action by his own unendurable sense of wrong. "I say she has done it, after Eunice has saved me, done it when Eunice was ready to be my wife." "How has she done it?" Between grief and indignation, his reply was involved in a confusion of vehemently spoken words, which I shall not attempt to reproduce. Eunice had reminded him that her sister had been publicly convicted of an infamous crime, and publicly punished for it by imprisonment. "If I consent to marry you," she said, "I stain you with my disgrace. That shall never be." With this resolution she had left him. "I have tried to convince her," Philip said, "that she will not be associated with her sister's disgrace when she bears my name. I have promised to take her far away from England, among people who have never even heard of her sister. Miss Jillgall has used her influence to help me. All in vain. There is no hope for us but in you. I am not thinking selfishly only of myself. She tries to conceal it, but, oh, she is broken-hearted. Ask the farmer's wife if you don't believe me. Judge for yourself. Go, for God's sake. Go to the farm." I made him sit down and compose himself. "You may depend on my going to the farm," I answered. "I shall write to Eunice today, and follow my letter tomorrow." He tried to thank me, but I would not allow it. "Before I consent to accept the expression of your gratitude," I said, "I must know a little more of you than I know now. This is only the second occasion on which we have met. Let us look back a little, Mr. Philip Dunboyne. You were Eunice's affianced husband, and you broke faith with her. That was a rascally action. How do you defend it?" His head sank. "I am ashamed to defend it," he answered. I pressed him without mercy. "You own yourself," I said, "that it was a rascally action?" "Use stronger language against me even than that, sir. I deserve it." "In plain words," I went on, "you can find no excuse for your conduct." "In the past time," he said, "I might have found excuses, but you can't find them now. I must not even look for them now." "Why not?" "I owe it to Eunice to leave my conduct at its worst, with nothing said by me to defend it." "What has Eunice done to have such a claim on you as that?" "Eunice has forgiven me." It was gratefully and delicately said. Ought I have allowed this circumstance to weigh with me? I ask in return, had I never committed any faults? As a fellow mortal and fellow sinner, had I any right to harden my heart against an expression of penitence which I felt to be sincere in its motive? But I was bound to think of Eunice. I did think of her before I ventured to accept the position, the critical position, as I shall presently show, of Philip's friend. After more than an hour of questions put without reserve, and of answers given without prevarication, I had travelled over the whole ground laid out by the narratives which appear in these pages, and had arrived at my conclusion, so far as Philip Dunboyne was concerned. I found him to be a man with nothing absolutely wicked in him, but with a nature so perilously weak in many respects that it might drift into wickedness unless a stronger nature was at hand to bolt it back. Married to a wife without force of character, the probabilities would point to him as likely to yield to examples which might make him a bad husband. Married to a wife with a will of her own, and with true love to sustain her, a wife who would know when to take the command and how to take the command, a wife who, finding him tempted to commit actions unworthy of his better self, would be far-sighted enough to perceive that her husband's sense of honor might sometimes lose its balance, without being on that account hopelessly depraved, and then, and in these cases only, the probabilities would point to Philip as a man likely to be the better and the happier for his situation, when the bonds of wedlock had got him. But the serious question was not answered yet. Could I feel justified in placing Eunice in the position toward Philip which I have just endeavored to describe? I dared not allow my mind to dwell on the generosity which had so nobly pardoned him, or on the force of character which had bravely endured the bitterest disappointment, the cruelest humiliation. The one consideration which I was bound to face was the sacred consideration of her happiness in her life to come. Leaving Philip with a few words of sympathy which might help him to bear his suspense, I went to my room to think. The time passed, and I could arrive at no positive conclusion. Either way, with or without Philip, the contemplation of Eunice's future harassed me with doubt. Even if I had conquered my own indecision, and had made up my mind to sanction the union of the two young people, the difficulties that now beset me would not have been dispersed. Knowing what I alone knew, I could certainly remove Eunice's one objection to the marriage. In other words, I had only to relate what had happened on the day when the chaplain brought the minister to the prison, and the obstacle of their union would be removed. But, without considering Philip, it was simply out of the question to do this, in mercy to Eunice herself. What was Helena's disgrace compared with the infamy which stained the name of the poor girl's mother? The other alternative of telling her part of the truth only was before me, if I could persuade myself to adopt it. I failed to persuade myself. My morbid anxiety for her welfare made me hesitate again. Human patience could endure no more. Rashness prevailed and prudence yielded. I left my decision to be influenced by the coming interview with Eunice. The next day I drove to the farm. Philip's entreaties persuaded me to let him be my companion, on one condition, that he waited in the carriage while I went into the house. I had carefully arranged my ideas, and had decided on proceeding with the greatest caution before I ventured on saying the all-important words which, once spoken, were not to be recalled. The worst of those anxieties under which the delicate health of Mr. Gracedieu had broken down was my anxiety now. Could I reconcile it to my conscience to permit a man innocent of all knowledge of the truth to marry the daughter of a condemned murderess without honestly telling him what he was about to do? Did I deserve to be pitied? Did I deserve to be blamed? My mind was still undecided when I entered the house. She ran to meet me as if she had been my daughter. She kissed me as if she had been my daughter. She fondly looked up at me as if she had been my daughter. At sight of that sweet young face, so sorrowful and so patiently enduring sorrow, all my doubts and hesitations, everything artificial about me with which I had entered the room, vanished in an instant. After she had thanked me for coming to see her, I saw her tremble a little. The uppermost interest in her heart was forcing its way outward to expression, try as she might to keep it back. "Have you seen Philip?" she asked. The tone in which she put that question decided me. I was resolved to let her marry him. Impulse, yes, impulse, asserting itself inexcusably in a man at the end of his life. I ought to have known better than to have given way, very likely. But am I the only mortal who ought to have known better, and did not? When Eunice asked if I had seen Philip, I owned that he was outside in the carriage. Before she could reproach me, I went on with what I had to say. "My child, I know what a sacrifice you have made, and I should honor your scruples if you had any reason for feeling them." "Any reason for feeling them?" She turned pale as she repeated the words. An idea came to me. I rang for the servant, and sent her to the carriage to tell Philip to come in. "My dear, I am not putting you to any unfair trial," I assured her. "I am going to prove that I love you as truly as if you were my own child." When they were both present, I resolved that they should not suffer a moment of needless suspense. Standing between them, I took Eunice's hand, and laid my other hand on Philip's shoulder, and spoke out plainly. "I am here to make you both happy," I said. "I can remove the only obstacle to your marriage, and I mean to do it. But I must insist on one condition. Give me your promise, Philip, that you will ask for no explanations, and that you will be satisfied with the one true statement which is all that I can offer to you." He gave his promise without an instant's hesitation. "Philip grants what I ask," I said to Eunice. "Do you grant it too?" Her hand turned cold in mine, but she spoke firmly when she said, "Yes." I gave her into Philip's care. It was his privilege to console and support her. It was my duty to say the decisive words. "Rouse your courage, dear Eunice. You are no more affected by Helena's disgrace than I am. You are not her sister. Her father is not your father. Her mother was not your mother. I was present in the time of your infancy, when Mr. Gracedieu's fatherly kindness received you as his adopted child. This, I declare to you both, on my word of honor, is the truth." How she bore it, I am not able to say. My foolish old eyes were filling with tears. I could just see plainly enough to find my way to the door, and leave them together. In my reckless state of mind, I never asked myself if time would be my accomplice, and keep the part of the secret which I had not revealed, or be my enemy, and betray me. The chances, either way, were perhaps equal. Chapter 64 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilkie Mills. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 64. The Truth Triumphant. The marriage was deferred at Eunice's request, as an expression of respect to the memory of Philip's father. When the time of delay had passed, it was arranged that the wedding ceremony should be held, after due publication of banns, at the parish church of the London suburb in which my house was situated. Miss Jillgall was bridesmaid, and I gave away the bride. Before we set out for the church, Eunice asked leave to speak with me for a moment in private. "Don't think," she said, "that I am forgetting my promise to be content with what you have told me about myself. I am not so ungrateful as that. But I do want, before I consent to be Philip's wife, to feel sure that I am not quite unworthy of him. Is it because I am of mean birth that you told me I was Mr. Gracedieu's adopted child, and told me no more?" I could honestly satisfy her so far. "Certainly not," I said. She put her arms round my neck. "Do you say that," she asked, "to make my mind easy, or do you say it on your word of honor?" "On my word of honor." We arrived at the church. Let Miss Jillgall describe the marriage in her own inimitable way. "No wedding breakfast when you don't want to eat it. No wedding speeches when nobody wants to make them, and nobody wants to hear them, and no false sentiment. Shedding tears and reddening noses on the happiest day in the whole year. A model marriage. I could desire nothing better if I had any prospect of being a bride myself." They went away for the honeymoon to a quiet place by the seaside, not very far from the town in which Eunice had passed some of the happiest and the wretchedest days in her life. She persisted in thinking it possible that Mr. Gracedieu might recover the use of his faculties at the last, and might wish to see her on his deathbed. "His adopted daughter," she gently reminded me, "is his only daughter now." The doctor shook his head when I told him what Eunice had said to me, and, the sad truth must be told, the doctor was right. Miss Jillgall returned on the wedding day to take care of the good man who had befriended her in her hour of need. Before the end of the week, I heard from her, and was disagreeably reminded of an incident which we had both forgotten, absorbed as we were in other and greater interests at the time. Mrs. Tenbruggen had again appeared on the scene. She had written to Miss Jillgall from Paris to say that she had heard of old Mr. Dunboyne's death, and that she wished to have the letter returned, which she had left for delivery to Philip's father on the day when Philip and Eunice were married. I had my own suspicions of what that letter might contain, and I regretted that Miss Jillgall had sent it back without first waiting to consult me. My misgivings, thus excited, were increased by more news of no very welcome kind. Mrs. Tenbruggen had decided on returning to her professional pursuits in England. Massage, now the fashion everywhere, had put money into her pocket among the foreigners, and her husband, finding that she persisted in keeping out of his reach, had consented to a compromise. He was ready to submit to a judicial separation, in consideration of a little income which his wife had consented to settle on him under the advice of her lawyer. Some days later, I received a delightful letter from Philip and Eunice, reminding me that I had engaged to pay them a visit at the seaside. My room was ready for me, and I was left to choose my own day. I had just begun to write my reply, gladly accepting the invitation, when an ominous circumstance occurred. My servant announced, "A lady," and I found myself face to face with Mrs. Tenbruggen. She was as cheerful as ever, and as eminently agreeable as ever. "I have heard it all from Helena," she said. "Philip's marriage to Eunice, I shall go and congratulate them, of course, and the catastrophe, how dramatic, of Helena Gracedieu. I warned Helena that Miss Helena would end badly. To tell the truth, she frightened me. I don't deny that I am a mischievous woman when I find myself affronted, quite capable of taking my revenge in my own small spiteful way. But poison and murder, the frightful subject. Let us drop it, and talk of something that doesn't make my hair, it's really my own hair, stand on end. Has Helena told you that I have got rid of my charming husband on easy pecuniary terms? Oh, you know that. Very well. I will tell you something that you don't know. Mr. Governor, I have found you out. May I venture to ask how? When I guessed which was which of those two girls, she answered, and guessed wrong, you deliberately encouraged the mistake. Very clever, but you overdid it. From that moment, though I kept it to myself, I began to fear I might be wrong. Do you remember Low Lanes, my dear sir, our charming old church? I have had another consultation with my lawyer. His questions led me into mentioning how it happened that I heard of Low Lanes. After looking again at his memorandum of the birth advertised in the newspaper, without naming the place, he proposed trying the church register at Low Lanes. Need I tell you the result? I know as well as you do that Philip has married the adopted child. He has had a mother-in-law who was hanged, and, what is more, he has the honor, through his late father, of being otherwise connected with the murderess by marriage, as his aunt. Bewilderment and dismay deprived me of my presence of mind. How did you discover that? I was foolish enough to ask. Do you remember when I brought the baby to the prison? She said. The father, as I mentioned at the time, had been a dear and valued friend of mine. No person could be better qualified to tell me who had married his wife's sister. If that lady had been living, I should never have been troubled with the charge of the child. Any more questions? Only one. Is Philip to hear of this? Oh, for shame! I don't deny that Philip insulted me grossly in one way, and that Philip's late father insulted me grossly in another way. But Mamma Tenbruggen is a Christian. She returns good for evil, and wouldn't for the world disturb the connubial felicity of Mr. and Mrs. Philip Dunboyne. The moment the woman was out of my house, I sent a telegram to Philip to say that he might expect to see me that night. I caught the last train in the evening, and I sat down to supper with those two harmless young creatures, knowing I must prepare the husband for what threatened them, and weakly deferring it when I found myself in their presence until the next day. Eunice was, in some degree, answerable for this hesitation on my part. No one could look at her husband and fail to see that he was a supremely happy man, but I detected signs of care in the wife's face. Before breakfast the next morning I was out on the beach, trying to decide how the inevitable disclosure might be made. Eunice joined me. Now, when we were alone, I asked if she was really and completely happy. Quietly and sadly, she answered, "Not yet." I hardly knew what to say. My face must have expressed disappointment and surprise. "I shall never be quite happy," she resumed, "till I know what it is that you kept from me on that memorable day. I don't like having a secret from my husband, though it is not my secret." "Remember your promise," I said. "I don't forget it," she answered. "I can only wish that my promise would keep back the thoughts that come to me in spite of myself." "What thoughts?" "There is something, as I fear, in the story of my parents, which you are afraid to confide to me. Why did Mr. Gracedieu allow me to believe, and leave everybody to believe, that I was his own child?" "My dear, I relieved your mind of those doubts on the morning of your marriage." "No, I was only thinking of myself at that time. My mother, the doubt of her is the doubt that torments me now." "What do you mean?" She put her arm in mine and held by it with both hands. "The mock mother," she whispered. "Do you remember that dreadful vision, that horrid whispering temptation in the dead of night? Was it a mock mother? Oh, pity me, I don't know who my mother was. One horrid thought about her is a burden on my mind. If she was a good woman, you, who love me, would surely have made me happy by speaking of her." Those words decided me at last. Could she suffer more than she had suffered already, if I trusted her with the truth? I ran the risk. There was a time of silence that filled me with terror. The interval passed. She took my hand and put it to her heart. "Does it beat as if I was frightened?" she asked. No, it was beating calmly. "Does it relieve your anxiety?" It told me that I had not surprised her. That unforgotten vision of the night had prepared her for the worst, after the time when I had told her that she was an adopted child. "I know," I said, "that those whispered temptations overpowered you again, when you and Helena met on the stairs, and you forbade her to enter Philip's room. And I know that love had conquered once more, when you were next seen sitting by Philip's bedside. Tell me, have you any misgivings now? Is there fear in your heart of the return of that tempting spirit in you in the time to come?" "Not while Philip lives." There, where her love was, there her safety was. And she knew it. She suddenly left me. I asked where she was going. "To tell Philip," was the reply. She was waiting for me at the door when I followed her to the house. "Is it done?" I said. "It is done," she answered. "What did he say?" "He said, 'My darling, if I could be fonder of you than ever, I should be fonder of you now.'" I have been blamed for being too ready to confide to Philip the precious trust of Eunice's happiness. If that reply does not justify me, Chapter 65 of The Legacy of Cain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilkie Mills. The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 65. Postscript. Later in the day, Mrs. Tenbruggen arrived to offer her congratulations. She asked for a few minutes with Philip alone. As a cat elaborates her preparations for killing a mouse, so the human cat elaborated her preparations for killing Philip's happiness. He remained uninjured by her teeth and her claws. "Somebody," she said, "has told you of it already?" And Philip answered, "Yes, my wife." For some months longer, Mr. Gracedieu lingered. One morning he said to Eunice, "I want to teach you to knit. Sit by me and see me do it." His hands fell softly on his lap. His head sank, little by little, on her shoulder. She could just hear him whisper, "How pleasant it is to sleep." Never was Death's dreadful work more gently done. Our married pair live now on the paternal estate in Ireland, and Miss Jillgall reigns queen of domestic affairs. I am still strong enough to pass my autumn holidays in that pleasant house, At times, my memory reverts to Helena Gracedieu and to what I discovered when I had seen her diary. How little I knew of that terrible creature when I first met with her, and fancied that she had inherited her mother's character. It was weak indeed to compare the mean vices of Mrs. Gracedieu with the diabolical depravity of her daughter. Here the doctrine of hereditary transmission of moral qualities must own that it has overlooked the fertility, for growth of good and for growth of evil equally, which is inherent in human nature. There are virtues that exalt us, and vices that degrade us, whose mysterious origin is, not in our parents, but in ourselves. When I think of Helena, I ask myself, where is the trace which reveals that the first murder in the world was the product of inherited crime? The criminal left the prison on the expiration of her sentence, so secretly that it was impossible to trace her. Some months later, Miss Jillgall received an illustrated newspaper published in the United States. She showed me one of the portraits in it. "Do you recognize the illustrious original?" she asked with indignant emphasis on the last two words. I recognized Helena. "Now read her new title," Miss Jillgall continued. I read, quote, "The Reverend Miss Gracedieu," close quote. The biographical notice followed. Here is an extract. Quote, "This eminent lady, the victim of a shocking miscarriage of justice in England, is now the distinguished leader of a new community in the United States. We hail in her the great intellect which asserts the superiority of woman over man. In the first French Revolution, the attempt made by men to found a rational religion met with only temporary success. It was reserved for the mightier spirit of woman to lay the foundations more firmly, and to dedicate one of the noblest edifices in this city to the worship of pure reason. Readers who wish for further information will do well to provide themselves with the Reverend Miss Gracedieu's orations, the 10th edition of which is advertised in our columns." Close quote. "I once asked you," Miss Jillgall reminded me, "what Helena would do when she came out of prison, and you said she would do very well. Oh, Mr. Governor, Solomon was nothing to you." End of chapter 65.